Margaret Aldridge's voice cut across the selection platform like a whip. Someone needs to tell that woman she doesn't belong here. She didn't whisper it. She didn't lean toward a friend and murmur it behind her hand. She said it loud enough for 3 rows of people to hear, loud enough for the men standing near the platform to turn and look, loud enough for Mara Holloway, standing 20 feet away in her best dress with her worn suitcase at her feet, to hear every single word. Mara didn't flinch. That was the thing that nobody in Red Hollow understood yet. She had stopped flinching a long time ago. But she felt it. She always felt it. 7 towns, 7 platforms. 7 times she had stood in front of strangers and waited to be chosen or discarded like furniture at an estate sale. And every single time, someone like Margaret Aldridge had found a way to make sure the discarding happened faster. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely invisible, if you've ever been told, without words, that you simply don't belong, then you already know what Mara Holloway carried into Red Hollow that afternoon. The question isn't whether she deserved better. The question is whether she was finally in the right place to receive it. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to this channel and follow Mara's story all the way to the end. Because what happens next in Red Hollow is going to stay with you long after the story is over. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. The stage road into Red Hollow was not kind to passengers. Mara had spent 11 hours on a coach that smelled like wet wool and axle grease, wedged between a traveling merchant who fell asleep on her shoulder somewhere past the second relay station and a young woman, barely 20, with nervous hands and a new dress, who had not stopped talking since they crossed the county line. Her name was Dorothea, and she was going to Red Hollow for the same reason Mara was: the selection. "I heard there are 12 men this season," Dorothea said, adjusting her collar for the 4th time in an hour. 12. My cousin said last spring there were only 7, and 3 of those were already spoken for by the time the brides arrived. Can you imagine? Traveling all that way only to find out half the choices were never really choices at all. Mara said, "I can imagine it." Something in her voice made Dorothea look at her properly for the first time. The girl took in the calloused hands, the lines at the corners of Mara's eyes, the way she sat without adjusting herself. Not comfortable exactly, but settled. The way someone sits when they've learned that comfort is not always available, and you'd better make peace with that. "Is this your first time?" Dorothea asked. Mara looked out the window at the brown scrub grass rolling past. "No." Dorothea waited, and when nothing more came, she turned back to her own reflection in the dusty glass and was quiet for a while. That was fine. Mara didn't need conversation. What she needed was to get through the next 48 hours without something inside her breaking that couldn't be put back together. She had a limited supply of attempts left. Not official attempts, not something anyone tracked on paper, but the kind you count yourself in the quiet hours of the night. The kind where you lie on a narrow cot in a rooming house and you think, how many more times can I do this before I stop being able to? 7 was already more than most women attempted. She knew what people said about that. She'd heard it directly often enough. Something must be wrong with her. Women didn't go through 7 selections unless there was something wrong with them. The market was not that cruel to women without cause. That was what people believed. That was what Margaret Aldridge believed, though Mara wouldn't learn Margaret's name until later that afternoon. The coach lurched to a stop in front of Red Hollow's main street, and the driver called down that they'd arrived, and Dorothea clutched her small bag to her chest and smoothed her dress one more time, and Mara picked up her suitcase, the same one she'd carried to every selection, brown leather with a brass clasp that no longer closed properly and had to be held shut with a length of cord, and stepped out into the light. Red Hollow was not impressive on first glance. It was a working town, not a prosperous one. The buildings along the main street had the look of structures that had survived hard winters by stubbornness rather than design. Boards warped slightly, paint faded to the color of old bone, awnings that drooped at the corners. There was a general store, a hotel with 4 rooms above the saloon, a feed and grain operation that appeared to be doing the most business of anything on the block. 2 churches, which told you something about the population's relationship with uncertainty. A land office, a small schoolhouse at the far end of the street that had clearly been closed for some time, the windows dark. People were already gathering near the platform erected at the center of town. Mara had seen this before too. The selection platform was always the same regardless of which town built it. A raised wooden stage about knee-height with enough room for perhaps a dozen women to stand, positioned so the men gathered below could look up at them. Someone had decided a long time ago that this was the correct arrangement. No one had questioned it since. The other brides were already clustering near the platform steps. Mara counted 9 of them before she stopped counting. Dorothea immediately moved toward 2 young women near the bottom of the steps, drawn by some instinct toward similarity of age, and within 30 seconds they were talking in the urgent, brittle way of people who are frightened and trying not to show it. Mara set her suitcase down at the edge of the gathering and waited. That was when she heard Margaret Aldridge's voice. "Someone needs to tell that woman she doesn't belong here." Mara located the speaker without turning her head. She'd developed that skill years ago, the ability to find the source of a voice without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her look. Margaret Aldridge was standing with 2 other women of similar age and similar bearing, the kind of women who had lived in a place long enough that they considered themselves part of its architecture. She was not directing her words at anyone in particular. She was directing them at the air, which was its own kind of precision. It meant everyone around her could hear without anyone being required to respond. The women with her made sounds of agreement. One of them glanced toward Mara and then quickly away. Mara breathed in through her nose. She breathed out. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the platform steps. The selection coordinator, a tired-looking man named Hargrove, who smelled like pipe tobacco and wore the expression of someone who wished he had chosen a different occupation, checked her name against his list and handed her a small square of cardboard with a number on it. 7. Of course it was 7. "You know the procedure?" he said, not really asking. "I know the procedure," Mara said. She climbed the steps and took her place on the platform. From up here, you could see more of the town. You could see the men gathering below the platform, perhaps 20 of them, ranging from young and awkward to middle-aged and deliberate. You could see the women in their clusters, the brides trying to appear calm, the townswomen trying to appear disinterested while watching everything. You could see the Aldridge woman still talking to her companions, still not looking at the platform, which somehow made her presence feel larger rather than smaller. And you could see, at the far edge of the gathering, a man who was not part of any cluster. He stood apart from the other men the way a fence post stands apart from the field it borders, not deliberately, not as a statement, just as a function of what he was. He was taller than most of the men around him, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that comes not from patience but from habit. He was dressed plainly. He was not watching the platform. He was watching Margaret Aldridge. Mara filed this away without attaching any particular meaning to it. The selection began. Hargrove called out each number in turn. The man whose number matched stepped forward. The bride with the matching number stepped to the front of the platform. They had 3 minutes to speak to each other before Hargrove called the next number. If a man wanted to request a courtship, he said so. If the bride agreed, she stepped down from the platform. If either party declined, they returned to their positions. It was clinical and slightly undignified, and no one in 30 years of frontier settlement had come up with anything better, so here they all were. The first 3 matches proceeded quickly. A young woman named Clara, Dorothea's friend from the steps, stepped down with a ruddy-faced farmer on the second exchange. Dorothea herself went third, her voice too quiet to hear from a distance, her expression cycling through about 14 different emotions in under 2 minutes before she finally nodded and stepped down. Mara watched without expression. By the 5th exchange, she could feel the mood of the crowd shifting. Not toward her specifically, not yet, but she recognized the particular quality of attention that preceded a public disappointment. The way people's eyes began to drift toward number 7 on her cardboard square. The way the men below were calculating. She was number 7, and she was 32 years old, and she was not what this crowd expected to see on a selection platform in a town like Red Hollow. The 6th exchange ended. The man stepped back. The woman stayed on the platform, declined, and a ripple of murmuring moved through the crowd. Mara knew that feeling too, being the one who said no rather than waiting to be told no. She had done it twice herself across her 7 selections. Both times people had reacted with the same slightly offended confusion, as if a woman in her position didn't have the standing to exercise preferences. Hargrove called number 7. The man who stepped forward was perhaps 40, sunburned, with the look of someone who worked land but did not own much of it. He climbed the 2 steps to the platform level and stood in front of Mara, and she could see him doing the same calculation the crowd had been doing, his eyes moving across her face and hands and frame with the practiced efficiency of a man assessing livestock at a county fair. He said, "You worked land before?" "Yes," Mara said. "Cook?" "Yes." "You're older than I expected." "I'm 32, Mara said. "That's not a secret. It's on the registration form." He looked at his boots. Then he looked back at her, and she could see the decision already made, already finished. "I appreciate your time," he said, which was the selection's polite formula for no, and he stepped back. The crowd was very quiet. Margaret Aldridge said something to the woman beside her, and the woman pressed her lips together to hold back a smile. Mara stood on the platform and looked out over the heads of the gathered crowd at the scrub flats beyond the edge of town, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her even now, "I am so tired. Not of the rejections. Not exactly. More tired of what the rejections required of her. This constant performance of dignified acceptance. This ongoing labor of making sure that her humiliation remained tidy and contained and did not inconvenience anyone. She was tired of being easy to dismiss. She was tired of taking up exactly the amount of space she'd been allotted, and not a fraction more. She was still thinking this when the man at the edge of the gathering moved. He didn't push through the crowd. He simply walked through it, and somehow that was more noticeable. People stepped aside not because they felt pressure, but because there was something about his movement that made stepping aside seem like the reasonable thing to do. He was the man she'd noticed earlier, the one who'd been standing apart, the one who'd been watching Margaret Aldridge with that particular quality of still attention. He stopped at the base of the platform steps and looked up at Mara. She looked down at him. "Hargrove," the man said, without looking away from her face. "What number is she?" Hargrove checked his list. 7, Mr. Vale. But the 7th match has concluded. Has she stepped down? A pause. No. Then it hasn't concluded. He looked at Hargrove now briefly, and something in that look made the coordinator suddenly find something important to examine on his clipboard. The man looked back at Mara. "I'm Gideon Vale. I own Iron Ridge, about 6 miles east of town, and I'd like to speak with number 7, if she's willing." The crowd had gone very still. Margaret Aldridge's voice, when it came, was careful, measured, the voice of a woman who knew how to frame a question so it didn't sound like an objection. "Gideon, dear, I'm not sure the protocol." "Margaret," he said it gently. He said it the way you'd close a door. "I'll ask you to let me handle my own business." He looked back at Mara. He was waiting. This was the moment that Mara would think about later, in the months and years that followed. Not the moment when her life changed. She wasn't certain it had changed yet, wasn't certain of anything except that this man was looking at her the way very few people ever had, with the focused attention of someone who was actually trying to see what was there rather than confirm what they expected to find. "All right," she said. He climbed the steps. He didn't ask her about cooking. He didn't ask about her age or her experience with land or whether she'd been married before. He stood about 3 feet away from her on the platform. A careful distance, she noticed, not crowding her. And he said, "You've been through this before." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "More than once." 7 times, she said. She said it straight, without apology, without flinching. She'd learned that flinching only made it worse. He absorbed this without visible reaction. "I'm going to ask you something, and I'd like you to answer honestly, even if you think the honest answer is going to end this conversation." She waited. What were you thinking about just now, when that man stepped back? Of all the things she'd expected him to say, this was not among them. She looked at him for a moment. His face was not easy to read. Weathered, angular, the face of a man who'd spent a decade outdoors making decisions that had real consequences. But his eyes were direct, and they held no cruelty, which was more than she could say for some of the men who'd stood in front of her on other platforms in other towns. She said, "I was thinking I was tired of being easy to dismiss." He was quiet for a moment. "My first wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Fever. She was gone in under a week, which means I never got to prepare, never got to say half the things I should have said. After that, I didn't look for anyone for 3 years. Didn't think I had the right to, maybe. Or maybe I just didn't think anyone was actually looking for what I had to offer. He paused. Iron Ridge is 6,000 acres of the most difficult land in this part of the territory. It is not a comfortable life. I have 17 hands who work for me, a house that functions but is not warm, and a supply system that someone recently pointed out to me is held together essentially with hope. Mara said carefully, "What exactly happened to your supply system?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like recognition. "We ran out of grain for the horses at the worst possible point in the season because I had trusted a verbal inventory instead of a written one. Cost me 3 horses and about $400 and 2 weeks of work. A written inventory would have prevented that." "Yes," he said. "It would have." They were both quiet for a moment. Below them, the crowd was watching. Margaret Aldridge had her arms crossed over her chest. Hargrove was pretending to sort through papers. Dorothea had turned from her new match to stare up at the platform with an expression of barely contained alarm. "I don't need a decoration," Gideon Vale said. "I don't need someone to perform the role of rancher's wife for the benefit of the town. I need a partner, someone who can see what's wrong and not wait for permission to fix it." Mara held his gaze. "I've been fixing things that weren't mine to fix my entire life," she said. "Most of the time nobody noticed." "I noticed," he said. "That's why I walked over here." The crowd below them had gone so quiet. She could hear the wind moving through the gap between the hotel and the feed store. She could hear her own pulse, which was not entirely steady, which she would not allow to show on her face. She said, "I'd be willing to consider a courtship." He said, 6 weeks. "If either of us finds it's not what we thought, we part without obligation." She said, "That's fair." He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and dry, the grip of someone who was not performing confidence but simply had it. Below the platform, a sound moved through the crowd. Not applause, not quite. Something more complicated than that. The sound of a community encountering something they hadn't planned for and weren't sure how to process. Margaret Aldridge said nothing. For the first time in 7 selections, in 11 years of trying, that silence felt like a victory. Mara picked up her suitcase and walked down the steps. The cord around the brass clasp held. For once, everything held. The wagon road to Iron Ridge was not the kind of road that forgave inattention. Gideon drove it himself, which surprised her. She had half expected a hand to be sent, some young man with a hat pulled low, who would load her suitcase without speaking and drive her out in silence, while his employer waited at the house in the comfortable posture of a man accustomed to having things brought to him. Instead, it was Gideon himself who arrived at the hotel the following morning with a 2-horse wagon and her suitcase already loaded before she'd finished her coffee, and he did not explain the gesture and she did not ask him to. They rode the first mile without speaking. This was, Mara had learned, one of the better tests of a person. Anyone could fill silence with pleasantries. The question was what happened when the pleasantries ran out, and there was nothing left but the actual texture of being in proximity to another human being. Some people became agitated. Some became performative, suddenly very interested in pointing out landmarks, asking questions they didn't particularly want answered. Some people simply could not tolerate it and talked until the other person wished they wouldn't. Gideon Vale drove his horses with the reins held loosely in both hands and watched the road and said nothing. After the first mile, Mara said, "How many horses did you lose in the supply failure?" He glanced at her. 3. "I said that yesterday." "I know, I'm asking which 3. A pause. He said, 2 working horses and a mare I'd had for 9 years. The mare was the one that cost me." "What was wrong with her?" "Nothing was wrong with her. She was good. She'd been on this land longer than most of my hands." He was quiet for a moment. "The grain ran out in the middle of a cold snap. I had enough feed for the younger horses because they were in the near stable. She was in the far pasture. By the time I realized the extent of the problem," he stopped, started again. "It was my fault. I knew the inventory system was unreliable. I kept meaning to address it." Mara said, "What stopped you?" "The same thing that stops most things from getting addressed," he said. "There was always something more urgent." She understood that. She understood it the way you understand something that has been true about your own life for so long that you've stopped seeing it as a problem and started seeing it as weather, just the prevailing condition, the thing you move through rather than the thing you change. They hit a rut in the road and the wagon lurched, and her suitcase slid 3 inches toward the edge of the bed, and neither of them commented on it. "Tell me about the house," she said. He took a moment before answering, which told her more than the answer eventually did. "It's large, 4 rooms upstairs, the main room downstairs, kitchen separate from the main building. Built it myself and two of my hands about 12 years ago, which means it's solid, but it reflects what I thought I needed at the time, rather than what actually turned out to be useful." "What's not useful?" "The kitchen is too far from the main room. In winter it means carrying food across open air, which—" He shrugged. "My wife used to say that was the thing she'd change first if she could change anything. She never got the chance." There it was, the first wife. Mara had known it was coming, had been waiting for the shape of it to appear in conversation. She did not look at him directly. She said, "What was her name?" "Clara." He said it steadily, but steadily was its own kind of evidence. The word had weight. She was better at the house than I ever gave her credit for. I understood that more clearly after she was gone. Mara did not say "I'm sorry" because that phrase had been emptied of meaning by overuse, and she did not traffic in empty things. She said, "Do you have people in the house? A cook? A housekeeper?" "I had a woman named Mrs. Pruitt for about 18 months after Clara died. She left last fall to go back east to her daughter. I haven't replaced her." "So who's been running the household?" "Running is generous," he said. "It functions. The hands eat. The floors are swept occasionally. That's approximately the current standard." Mara looked at the road ahead of them. She said, "When we get there, I'd like to see the supply records. Whatever you have." He glanced at her again, and this time the look held something she couldn't quite name. Not surprise, but something adjacent to it. Something that might have been relief. "I'll show you whatever you want to see." Iron Ridge came into view about 20 minutes later, and it did not look like a ranch that was falling apart. That was the first thing she understood about the problem. It wasn't visible from the outside. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure, weathered but well built, set back from the road with a large barn to its left, and a series of outbuildings arranged in what had clearly once been a deliberate order that had since drifted from its original logic. The land rolled away in every direction, grass brown at this time of year but extensive, and the fencing she could see from the road was intact, which told her the hands were doing their jobs with the physical work. But she'd learned to look past the physical work. She'd grown up on a farm in eastern Ohio. Not a successful farm, a farm held together by her father's stubbornness and her mother's refusal to acknowledge difficulty. And she had watched the way systems failed not from sudden catastrophe, but from accumulated small neglects. The fence that was repaired, but the hinge on the gate that wasn't. The harvest that came in, but the storage that wasn't properly prepared. The things that seemed fine until they suddenly weren't. Gideon helped her down from the wagon. She didn't need the help, but she took it, because she understood that this was part of how people negotiated the early days of an uncertain arrangement, and she was not so proud that she couldn't allow someone their courtesies. A man came from the direction of the barn, mid-40s, a face like cured leather, moving with the particular rolling gait of someone who'd spent 30 years on horseback. He stopped when he saw her. His expression was the studied neutrality of someone who had opinions he'd decided to keep to himself, at least for now. "Miss Holloway," Gideon said, "this is Pete Darvish. He's my head hand and has been with Iron Ridge for 11 years. "Miss," Pete said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Mr. Darvish," Mara said. Pete looked at Gideon. Something moved between them. The shorthand of two people who've worked alongside each other long enough that full sentences aren't always necessary. Then Pete said, "I'll put the horses up," and took the wagon, and that was apparently all that needed to happen. Gideon carried her suitcase inside. The main room was exactly what he'd described and exactly what she'd expected, which was not the same as being prepared for it. It was a room that had once been inhabited by someone who cared about it. You could see the evidence. A rug that had been good quality before years of boot traffic reduced it to its current state. Curtains at the windows that matched in a way that suggested deliberate selection rather than accident. A set of shelves along one wall that had clearly been built to display things rather than just store them. But the warmth had gone out of it. The details that make a house feel occupied rather than merely used, small things, but their absence accumulated, were all missing. There were no flowers, dried or fresh, no mending basket, nothing on the shelves except a few books and a lantern and what appeared to be 3 years of dust. She didn't say any of this. She said, Show me where you keep the supply records. He showed her. They were in the kitchen, which was cold and slightly damp and smelled like a combination of coffee and old flour, kept in a wooden box on the shelf nearest the door. Mara lifted the box down and set it on the kitchen table. The table at least was clean, she noted. Someone was maintaining the surfaces, and opened it. The records inside were approximately what she'd feared. There were receipts going back about 4 years, some of them water-stained, none of them organized by any system she could identify. There were lists in at least 3 different handwriting styles, which meant at least 3 different people had been responsible for the records at various points, and none of them had thought to establish a consistent format before taking over from the previous person. There was a ledger book, but it had only been used sporadically, with months-long gaps between entries, and the most recent entry was dated 14 months ago. Mara sat down at the table. She said, "Do you have paper? And a pen?" Gideon found both. She pushed the box to one side and started writing. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Making a list of what I need to understand before I can tell you what's wrong." She wrote without looking up. "I know that's not what courtship is supposed to look like." A pause. "I didn't hire you," he said. "You're not obligated to do this." "I know," she said. "I want to understand what I'm looking at." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and she was aware of him watching her work. Not hovering, not directing, just watching with that focused attention he'd shown on the platform. After a few minutes, he said, "Can I get you coffee?" She looked up. "Yes, thank you." He made it himself, which again was not what she expected, and brought it to the table without ceremony, and she drank it while she worked, and neither of them spoke for almost an hour. What she found in that hour was worse than a single supply failure and better than total collapse, which was approximately the range she'd been expecting. The grain incident wasn't an anomaly. It was the most dramatic expression of a pattern that showed up everywhere in the records. Things were ordered by memory rather than calculation. Things were restocked when someone noticed they were low rather than before they became low. The records that existed were reactive rather than predictive, which meant the ranch was always operating slightly behind its own needs, always catching up rather than staying ahead. There was also a gap of about 8 months, roughly 2 years after Clara died, where the records essentially ceased to exist. Mara looked at that gap for a long time without saying anything about it. "Well," she said finally. Gideon said, "That bad?" "Not as bad as it could be," she said. "The physical operations are solid. I can see that from the receipts. Your hands are doing the actual work of the ranch properly. The problem is that nobody has been running the systems behind the physical work. The accounting is reactive. The ordering is based on whoever happens to notice a shortage. You don't have a written inventory of any kind, which means every decision is made from someone's estimate, and estimates are wrong in proportion to how tired and distracted the person making them is." He was quiet. "The grain situation could happen again," she said. "Not necessarily grain. It could be something else entirely, but the conditions that created it are still here." He said, "What would fix it?" "A proper inventory system, a restocking schedule with written thresholds, specific numbers, not someone's sense of when things are getting low. A single record book, consistently maintained with one person responsible for it." She paused. "And probably someone who has time to focus on this and nothing else. Your hands are busy with the land. You're busy with management. The household administration is falling through the gap between those two things." Gideon looked at his hands on the table. He said, "Clara did most of this. I didn't understand how much she was doing until she wasn't doing it anymore." There it was again. The shape of a loss that hadn't finished working through the structure of things. Mara said carefully, "I'm not Clara." "No," he said. He looked up. "I know that." "I just want to make sure we're clear on that point," she said, "because I'm willing to help build something here. But I can't build something that's designed around the shape of a person who's gone." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not offense, not resistance. More like someone pressing on a bruise to understand its extent. "That's fair," he said, "and honest." "I'm usually both," she said. "It doesn't always make me easy to be around." He said, "I found comfortable people rarely fix anything." Outside, one of the horses made a sound in the barn, and somewhere further away one of the hands called something to another hand, and the ordinary sounds of a working ranch moved through the quiet of the kitchen, and Mara thought, this place could be something. It already almost is. It just needs someone willing to look at it clearly. She was willing to look at things clearly. That had never been the problem. The problem had always been finding a place that could tolerate being looked at. She stayed in the house that first night in the upstairs room Gideon showed her. Simply furnished, clean enough, with a window that looked east toward open country. She did not sleep particularly well, which was normal for her in a new place. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of Iron Ridge settling around her, the particular creaks and drafts of an old house, the distant sound of horses shifting in the barn, the wind off the flats that found every gap in the window frame and made itself known. She thought about the supply records. She thought about the 8-month gap in the ledger. She thought about a man who knew how to manage 6,000 acres and 17 hands and had somehow never built a system to track grain because once there had been a person who handled that, and then there wasn't. And the grief of the loss had made the administrative failure invisible by comparison. She thought about her own life, the accumulation of it, the 11 years of selection platforms and small rooms and being evaluated against a standard she'd never been asked to help define. She thought, I am 32 years old and I am lying in a bed that belongs to no one, and I have 6 weeks to determine whether this is a place I can build something or another stop on a road that doesn't go anywhere. She was still thinking this when she fell asleep somewhere past midnight, and she slept until just before dawn. And when she woke, she went downstairs and started the kitchen fire herself because there was no one else to do it. And by the time Gideon came down, the coffee was made, and she had already identified 4 more problems in the supply records she'd left on the kitchen table. He looked at the records. He looked at her. He said, Did you sleep? Some, she said. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her and said, Show me. She showed him. The next 10 days established a rhythm that neither of them had planned, and both of them were careful not to name, because naming it would require acknowledging what it was, and acknowledging it would require deciding what to do about it, and neither of them was ready for that yet. Mara worked in the mornings on the supply system. She had asked Gideon for a proper ledger book, not a repurposed account book, an actual inventory ledger. And Pete Darvish had ridden into Red Hollow and come back with 2 of them from the general store, which told her that Pete had been asked to go quickly, which told her Gideon was paying attention. She built the system from scratch. She started with a physical walkthrough of every building on the property. The main barn, the 2 secondary outbuildings, the root cellar, the dry goods pantry, the kitchen stores, the equipment shed. She did it with a pencil and a fresh sheet of paper, and she wrote down everything she found, which was the kind of task that sounds simple and is not. It requires patience and precision and the willingness to count sacks of flour rather than estimate them, to open every container rather than assume, to look at the back of the shelf rather than just the front. Pete watched her do this on the second morning, standing in the barn doorway with his arms crossed, not interfering but not leaving either. She said without looking up from her paper, Mr. Darvish, do you have a number in your head for how many bushels of oats are in this barn right now? A pause. About 40, she finished counting. 31. Another pause. It's not your fault, she said. Estimates drift. That's what happens when you're relying on memory instead of record. After a while, the number in your head stops updating. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's what happened with the grain. Yes. He came further into the barn. He said, What do you need from me? She looked at him then. He was watching her with an expression that was no longer carefully neutral. Something in the last 30 seconds had shifted his assessment of the situation, and she recognized the shift because she'd seen it before. The moment when someone decides that a person might actually know what they're doing. I need to understand your restocking cycle, she said. How you currently decide when to order, and how you know what to order. He pulled up a hay bale and sat down. And for the next hour he talked and she wrote, and by the end of that hour she had the outline of a system that could replace the one that wasn't working. She built it over the following week. It was not complicated. The best systems rarely were. A master inventory sheet updated every Monday morning. Threshold numbers written in red beside every item, the number below which an order had to be placed. A monthly reconciliation against the receipts to catch discrepancies. One person responsible for the Monday update, Pete agreed to take this on because Pete turned out to be, underneath his careful neutrality, the kind of man who was privately embarrassed by the grain incident and had wanted something like this for longer than he'd known how to ask for. Gideon watched the system take shape without inserting himself into it, which was, she decided, one of the more intelligent things he did. He had enough confidence in his own authority that he didn't feel compelled to demonstrate it by interfering with work that was going well. Not all men were like that. She had known many men who were not like that. On the 8th day, something happened that she hadn't planned for. She was in the kitchen reorganizing the dry goods pantry, a task that had expanded from her original scope but that clearly needed doing, when she heard voices in the yard. She didn't recognize the female voice, but she recognized the quality of it. The particular bright precision of a woman who is performing friendliness in the way that some people perform a role. She came to the kitchen door and looked out. Margaret Aldridge was standing in the yard. She was with her husband, a thin, careful-looking man named Gerald, who had the air of someone who had learned decades ago that the most comfortable position in any situation was slightly behind his wife. And she was talking to Gideon with the warm, concerned expression of a woman who was certain she had everyone's best interests at heart. "We just wanted to see how things were settling in," Margaret was saying. "The town has been asking, you know how people are. They worry about you, Gideon." "I appreciate that," Gideon said. He was standing on the porch with his arms at his sides, which was not a hostile posture but was not a welcoming one either. "And the arrangement? It's going all right? She's settling in comfortably?" The pause before she was barely perceptible. Barely. Mara stepped out of the kitchen door and into the yard. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said. "Mr. Aldridge." Margaret turned. For a fraction of a second, the fraction before her social reflexes caught up with her actual response, something crossed her face that was not warmth. Then the warmth was back, professional and calibrated. "Miss Holloway, we were just stopping by to welcome you properly." "That's kind," Mara said. She walked across the yard and stood beside Gideon, not touching him, not crowding him, just standing in her own space, which happened to be adjacent to his space, which was its own kind of statement without being a statement. Margaret's eyes moved between them. "How are you finding the ranch?" "Good land," Mara said. "The operations are solid. I've been working on the supply system." A blink. "The supply system?" "Inventory and restocking," Mara said pleasantly. "It needed organizing." Gerald Aldridge made a small sound that might have been surprise. Margaret's expression stayed smooth, but something behind it was recalculating. "Well," Margaret said, "that's very practical of you." She looked at Gideon. "Gideon, we did want to mention, the Harvest Social is in 3 weeks. Naturally, we'd hope to see you there, and of course," another pause, slightly different in quality from the first, "your guest." "We'll be there," Gideon said. "Wonderful." Margaret smiled at both of them, and the smile reached exactly far enough and no further. "We won't keep you. We know how busy a working ranch is." She and Gerald left in the same direction they'd come, and Mara watched them go until they were past the gate, and then she went back inside because she had 3 more shelves to organize, and the morning was getting away from her. Gideon followed her into the kitchen. He said, "She does that about twice a month." "Does what?" "Comes by with some pretext to see what's happening here." He leaned against the door frame. "She was a close friend of Clara's. After Clara died, she decided she had a responsibility to monitor the situation." Mara set a sack of cornmeal on the shelf. "Does she always bring her husband?" "Only when she wants to make a point." "What point is she trying to make today?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Probably that she wanted to see you for herself. Size up what she's dealing with." Mara looked at the shelf. She said, "And what does she think she's dealing with?" "I expect," he said, "she hasn't decided yet." She processed this and filed it away, because information about Margaret Aldridge and what she'd decided or hadn't decided was relevant data, and Mara was a person who kept track of relevant data. She said, "Hand me that jar on the left." He handed it to her without comment. On the 12th day, something changed between them, and it happened in such an ordinary way that she almost missed it. She had been trying for 3 days to fix the kitchen door, which had a hinge that was pulling loose from the frame, causing the door to drag on the floor whenever it was opened more than halfway. She'd mentioned it to Pete, who had agreed it needed doing and added it to his list of things to attend to, which list was apparently very long. On the 12th morning, she decided she would fix it herself, because the dragging sound every time she came into the kitchen was becoming the specific variety of minor irritant that she knew would eventually expand to fill all available space if not addressed. She found tools in the equipment shed. She came back to the kitchen with a hammer and a handful of screws and spent 20 minutes resetting the hinge. Gideon came in while she was testing the door, swinging it open and closed, checking the clearance, feeling the weight of it move properly now on a hinge that was solid again. He looked at the door. He looked at her. He said, "When did you learn to do that?" "My father's farm," she said. "There were 5 children and not much money, and my father believed that anything worth having was worth maintaining yourself." "Did you like it? The farm?" She considered this honestly, the way she considered most things. Parts of it. "I liked knowing how things worked. I didn't like the part where we were always one bad season from losing it, and then we had 2 bad seasons in a row, and we did lose it." He was quiet. Then, "How old were you?" 17. "What did you do?" "Went to work for a family in town. Then another family. Then I started managing a boarding house when I was 22. I was good at it." She set the hammer on the counter. "Boarding houses are not so different from ranches, organizationally. More people, smaller scale. Same principle. Too many things that need to happen in the right order, not enough people to do them all, and someone has to keep track of the whole picture or it falls apart." Gideon leaned against the counter and looked at her with that quality of attention she was becoming used to and not entirely comfortable with, because it was the kind of attention that made you feel seen, and being seen was not something she had a great deal of practice accepting. He said, "Why did you leave the boarding house?" She said, "The man who owned the building sold it." She picked up the hammer. "Then I tried to find work managing another one, and I spent about 2 years doing that. And somewhere in there I realized I was always managing someone else's thing, and there was no path that led to anything of my own. So I tried the selections." She said it matter-of-factly because that was the honest shape of it. Not a tragedy, just a series of logical decisions made by a practical person trying to build something in the conditions that were available. 8 times, he said. 8, counting this one. She looked at him directly. "I know what that looks like." "What does it look like?" "Like desperation," she said. "Like a woman who has failed at something repeatedly and keeps trying anyway out of stubbornness or limited options." He said, "Is that what it is?" She thought about it. She said, "It started out as one. It became the other. And then somewhere around the 5th time I stopped caring which one it looked like and started just trying to make honest assessments of each situation." She paused. "Most of the situations were not honest in return." He said, "This situation is going to be honest, whatever it is." She believed him. That was the thing she hadn't expected. She believed him, not because he was charming, not because she was hopeful, but because in 12 days of close proximity, she had not caught him in a single evasion. He was a man with silences, with losses he carried imperfectly, with a ranch that reflected the gaps in his attention, but he was not a man who pretended things were other than they were. That was rare enough to be worth something. She said, "I know." She put the hammer back. "I'm going to look at the kitchen ceiling situation this afternoon. There's a section near the east wall where the plaster is separating." He said, "Of course there is." She said, "It's not bad yet, but it will be if we get heavy rain." He said, "Can you fix it?" She said, "I can tell you what it needs. Whether I can fix it myself depends on what I find when I get up there." He said, "I'll hold the ladder." And that was how it went. Not with grand declarations, not with the language of romance or courtship as anyone outside Iron Ridge would have recognized it, but with a man holding a ladder steady while a woman climbed it to look at the ceiling above her head and told him honestly what she found. What she found was a crack about 18 inches long running along the joint where the wall met the ceiling, the plaster on one side of it pulling slightly away from the lath beneath. It was, as she'd said, not catastrophic. Not yet. But it was the kind of thing that would become catastrophic in exactly the circumstances you least wanted it to. "You need to seal this before the rains," she said from the top of the ladder. "I know," he said. "I've known for about 3 months." She looked down at him. He was looking up at her, and there was something in his expression that was not quite humor, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a person who is tired of their own procrastination and can admit it. She said, "What stops you?" He said, "I'm better at things that have to happen right now than things that have to happen before they become urgent." She said, "That's the same problem as the inventory system." He said, "Yes, I know." She said, I'll add it to the list, she began. She climbed down the ladder and he steadied it until her feet were on the floor, and then he stepped back and she made a note on her paper. And outside, the afternoon light was doing something complicated with the clouds on the horizon, and somewhere in the ranch the ordinary work of 17 men was proceeding without drama. And this was the life, she thought. Not the dramatic version, not the simplified version, but the actual version, the one that was held together by small things attended to properly. She could do this work. She had been doing it in one form or another her entire life. The question that remained was whether this was a place that would let her do it on her own terms, whether in 6 weeks they would both look at what had been built and decide it was worth building further. She didn't know the answer yet, but she knew the crack in the ceiling needed sealing before the rains, and she knew Gideon Vale would hold the ladder while she worked, and she knew that Pete Darvish had started doing the Monday inventory count without being reminded, and she knew the kitchen door now swung clean on its hinge. Small things. But they were the kind of small things that told you what the larger things would look like. She added the ceiling repair to her list, put her pencil down, and went back to the dry goods pantry to finish what she'd started. The Harvest Social in Red Hollow was held in the feed and grain warehouse on the east end of Main Street, which was the only building in town large enough to hold the population when the population decided to gather all at once. Someone had made an effort with the space. There were lanterns hung from the ceiling beams, and long tables set with food that the women of the town had been preparing for the better part of a week. Pies and bread and roasted meats and pickled things in jars that caught the light. The floor had been swept and the worst of the grain dust beaten out of the corners, and a 3-piece band had set up near the far wall and was playing something that suggested dancing without quite demanding it. Mara had been to events like this before. Different towns, same architecture of community. The gathering that was nominally about harvest or celebration, but was actually about the social mapping of who stood where and with whom and what that meant. She'd always found them exhausting, not because she disliked people, but because she was too aware of the subtext to ignore it, and following subtext while simultaneously trying to eat a plate of someone's excellent cornbread required a kind of divided attention that tired her out. She had dressed carefully without dressing up, which was its own kind of statement. The dark green wool she'd brought was the best thing in her suitcase. Not fancy, but well made, and she wore it the way she wore most things, without apology. Gideon had met her in the main room when she came downstairs, and he'd looked at her for a moment in that way he had of looking at things he found worth looking at, and said, "Ready?" And she'd said yes, and they had ridden into town in the wagon with Pete Darvish following on horseback, because Pete had a woman in Red Hollow he was courting on his own time and saw no reason to make 2 trips. The warehouse was already half full when they arrived. Mara felt the room's attention shift when they walked in. Not dramatically, not the way a room shifts when something shocking happens, but the way water moves when you put something in it. A subtle, encompassing adjustment. Eyes that were already in motion found reasons to pause. Conversations that were already happening found ways to accommodate a new subject. She was used to this. She kept her face pleasant and her shoulders level, and she did not look for Margaret Aldridge, because looking for her would be the same as admitting she was thinking about her, which she was, but there was no reason to make that visible. Gideon put a hand briefly at the small of her back as they moved through the door. Just a touch, barely that, the lightest possible indication of presence, and she was aware of it for longer than its duration. The first person to approach them was a man named Calloway, who ran the land office and had the enthusiastic social manner of someone who genuinely liked people and couldn't understand why everyone didn't feel the same way. He shook Gideon's hand and then turned to Mara and shook hers with equal energy and said, "Miss Holloway, I've heard you've been making some real improvements out at Iron Ridge." And Mara said, "Early days?" And Calloway said, "Pete Darvish said you built them an inventory system that'll save the ranch about $400 a year in preventable losses." And Mara said, "Pete is generous." And Calloway laughed and moved on. She looked at Gideon. He said, "Pete talks." "Evidently," she said. "Is that a problem?" She considered. "No," she said. "It's accurate." But she noted it. Noted that information was moving about her through the town's informal networks, which meant she was being assessed in absentia by people she hadn't met yet, their opinions forming from secondhand accounts before she had the chance to be present in them. This was the way of small communities. You couldn't prevent it. You could only try to make sure what they were hearing was worth hearing. The food was, as she'd suspected from the smell when they walked in. Very good. She ate with the honest appetite of someone who had been doing physical work for 2 weeks and didn't see any reason to pretend otherwise, which earned her a nod of approval from the older woman serving at the food table, a woman named Mrs. Hatch, who turned out to have been running the informal catering operations at Red Hollow's community events for about 25 years and had strong opinions about people who took small portions out of performance rather than preference. "You're the one from Iron Ridge," Mrs. Hatch said, refilling Mara's plate without being asked. "Yes," Mara said. "Good," Mrs. Hatch said, as though this settled something. "Gideon Vale needs someone practical out there. That ranch has been running on stubbornness and luck since Clara died, and stubbornness and luck will only carry you so far." Mara said, "Did you know Clara well?" Mrs. Hatch's expression shifted, not with grief exactly, but with the particular weight of a memory that has had years to settle into something complicated. "She was a good woman. Quiet, in a way that people mistook for soft. She wasn't soft. She just picked her battles." She looked at Mara directly. "You pick yours too, I'd guess." "I try to," Mara said. "Then you and this town will get along fine," Mrs. Hatch said, "once the town figures itself out." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she arrived in Red Hollow, and she filed it away with the care it deserved. She was halfway through a piece of apple pie that she had decided was the best apple pie she'd eaten in several years when she became aware that Margaret Aldridge had entered her field of vision. Margaret was moving through the room in the way of a woman who knew exactly where she was going without appearing to be going anywhere. She stopped to speak to 3 separate groups on her way across the warehouse floor, and each stop was exactly long enough to be sociable without being so long that it looked like lingering. It was the social navigation of someone who had been doing it a long time and had made it into something approaching an art form. She stopped in front of Mara. "Miss Holloway," she said, "you look well." "Thank you," Mara said. "So do you." "I hear you've been very busy at Iron Ridge." "There was quite a bit to organize," Mara said. Margaret smiled. It was a real smile in its mechanics, the corners of the mouth, the slight softening around the eyes. But real smiles and warm smiles were not the same thing, and Mara had learned the difference in enough social rooms to read it reliably. "I'm sure. A ranch that size requires so much management." A pause, perfectly placed. "It's not for everyone." "No," Mara said. "It isn't." Another pause. Margaret seemed to be deciding something. Then she said, "I'll be honest with you, Miss Holloway." Mara waited. "I've known Gideon Vale for 15 years. I was close with his wife. I care about his well-being, which means I care about the decisions he makes." She kept her voice pleasant, even warm, the tone of a woman saying something she considered to be simply true rather than aggressive. "He made an unusual choice at the selection. People are still talking about it." "I'm sure they are," Mara said. "Not all of what they're saying is unkind," Margaret said, which was the sort of sentence that acknowledged unkindness without accepting responsibility for it. "But there are questions about whether this arrangement serves Gideon's actual interests, whether someone with your particular—" She paused, and in the pause was the entirety of her meaning. History is really the right fit for a place like Iron Ridge. The warehouse noise moved around them. The band had started something livelier, and at the far end of the room a few couples had moved to the cleared section of floor. Mara was aware of several people nearby who had adjusted their positions in the last 30 seconds, in ways that had nothing to do with wanting to be near the food. She kept her face still. She said, "My particular history." 7 selections, Margaret said gently, as though she were being kind. Mara set down her plate. Not roughly, not dramatically. She set it down the way you set something down when you're making sure your hands are free. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said, "I'd like to ask you something, and I'd like you to answer honestly." Margaret's expression registered something, a small recalibration. "Of course. Have you watched me do anything at Iron Ridge that gave you reason to doubt my competence?" A beat. "I visited briefly. You visited once for about 20 minutes, and I was working in the kitchen. Have you seen anything in that time or since that suggests I'm not capable of the work?" Margaret's jaw was still set in its pleasant expression, but around the edges of it, something was tightening. Competence at ranch work isn't the only consideration. What are the other considerations? Fit, Margaret said. Temperament. Whether someone understands what Iron Ridge is and what it needs, and whether they can... She paused again, and this time the pause had a sharper edge. Sustain that, long term. Mara looked at her. She looked at her the way she looked at supply records, the way she looked at cracked ceiling plaster, without blinking, without softening, trying to understand the actual structure of the problem. She said, "You think I'm going to fail?" "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that it's worth considering whether Gideon's judgment in this instance has been Mrs. Aldridge." She said it quietly. She did not raise her voice. She had learned a long time ago that volume was what people used when they didn't have anything more effective. "I have spent years in rooms where people were certain I was going to fail. Sometimes they told me directly. Often they did what you're doing. They framed it as concern for someone else so they didn't have to take responsibility for what they actually meant." She picked her plate back up. "I understand you cared about Clara. I understand that makes this complicated. But I am not Clara, and I am not a problem you need to manage on Gideon's behalf. I'm a person who is doing a job and doing it well, and if you have a specific concern about something specific I have done, I will listen to it, but I won't stand here and defend my existence." The silence that opened between them lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Margaret said, "You're very direct." "Yes," Mara said. "I've been told." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll let you enjoy your pie." And she moved away with the same controlled grace with which she'd arrived, and Mara watched her go and then turned back to her plate. Mrs. Hatch appeared at her elbow. Mara hadn't noticed her approach, which meant she'd been standing close enough to hear at least part of the conversation. "Good pie?" Mrs. Hatch asked. "Very good," Mara said. "I've been waiting 20 years for someone to say that to Margaret Aldridge," Mrs. Hatch said, and went back to her serving table. Mara ate her pie and did not allow herself to feel triumph, because triumph at this stage would be premature, and she was a practical person. Margaret Aldridge had not been defeated. She had been met, which was different. Defeated enemies retreated. Met ones recalculated. She was still thinking this when Gideon appeared beside her. He said, "I saw you talking to Margaret." "We had a conversation," Mara said. "How did it go?" "We established our positions," she said. "It was useful." He looked at her for a moment. "She said something that bothered you." "She said several things that bothered me," Mara said. "That's not the same as being bothered by them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She's not a bad person." "I know," Mara said. And she did know this, which was what made it complicated. Margaret Aldridge was not a villain. She was a woman who believed she was doing something right, and had enough social power to act on that belief without much friction. Those people were harder to deal with than actual villains, because actual villains didn't expect you to be grateful. She's a person who's decided she knows what's best for you and is used to acting on that without anyone pushing back. "Most people don't push back on Margaret," Gideon agreed. "I noticed." Mara set down her empty plate. "She's going to be a problem." "Yes," he said. "Probably." "I'm telling you in advance," she said, "so you're not surprised when it becomes one." He said, "I appreciate that." And then, after a moment, he said, "Would you like to dance?" And she turned to look at him because the question was so entirely outside the register of what she'd been thinking about that her mind had to rearrange itself around it. She said, "I'm not a graceful dancer." He said, "I'm not either." She said, "All right." And he led her to the cleared section of floor where 3 other couples were moving to something slow and patient from the band, and they danced with the careful awkwardness of 2 people who are both aware that they're being watched and have both decided not to perform for the watchers. He was not, as advertised, a graceful dancer. He was also not apologetic about it. He moved the way he did most things, deliberately, without flourish, in a way that got the job done without pretending it was more than it was. She matched him because matching was something she was good at, adjusting to the rhythm of whatever situation she was in. She was aware of the room's attention. She kept her eyes level and her shoulders straight, and did not look for Margaret Aldridge. When the song ended, he said, "Thank you," and she said, "Thank you." And they moved back to the edge of the room, and neither of them mentioned it again, which was somehow exactly right. The evening continued. She talked to Calloway again, and to a farmer named Brewer, who had land about 4 miles south of Iron Ridge, and was curious, in a genuine, rather than prying way, about the inventory system Pete had apparently described to half the county. She talked to a woman named Lena Marsh who ran a small seamstress operation out of the back of her house and who had a pragmatic, unsentimental quality that Mara found immediately comfortable. She talked to a young man who worked one of the smaller ranches to the west and who had clearly been told by someone to be polite to her and was doing his dutiful best. She did not seek out Margaret Aldridge again, and Margaret, for her part, maintained a distance that was not retreat and not approach, but something calibrated between them, present, aware, watching. It was almost 10 o'clock when the thing happened that changed the evening. She had stepped outside for air. The warehouse, with its full complement of Red Hollow residents and its three-piece band and its accumulated warmth of bodies and food and lanterns, had become the kind of environment she could tolerate for exactly so long before she needed to breathe something that wasn't it. She was standing on the far side of the building, in the space between the warehouse wall and the fence of the adjacent property, and she was looking at the sky, which was clear and populated with more stars than she ever saw in town. She heard the voices before she saw the people. Two women coming around the corner of the building, not aware she was there, because if they'd known she was there, they wouldn't have said what they said. Or perhaps they would have. Some people were bold enough for that. "Can't understand what he was thinking," the first voice said. "There were women on that platform half her age." "It's because she's useful," the second voice said. "You know how men are about useful women. They mistake usefulness for something it isn't. She's not even—" And here the first voice dropped slightly, as though even in the dark, even without an audience, the specific cruelty of what she was about to say required some small concession to discretion. "She's not the kind of woman a man like Gideon Vale should be seen with. That's simply the truth of it." "Margaret thinks the same," the second voice said. "She's been saying for weeks that she's going to talk to him, properly. Make him understand what people think." "And what does he say?" "That's the thing. He won't be talked to. You know how he gets?" A pause. "But if the courtship ends badly, and it will end badly, that sort of thing always does, she'll be the first person he calls. She's known him 15 years. She's not going to let that woman walk into his life." And Mara stepped around the corner. Both women stopped speaking simultaneously, the way animals freeze when they become aware of a predator. Not from guilt, she noted, but from surprise. The first was a woman she'd seen inside but not spoken to, perhaps 40, with the look of someone who had never been required to question whether her opinions were welcome. The second was younger, wearing a dress that cost more than Mara's entire suitcase. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Mara said, "Evening." The first woman said, "Miss Holloway," and her voice was entirely steady, which told Mara something about her. The younger one looked at the wall. Mara said, "It's a beautiful night." She looked up at the sky. "The stars are clearer out here than they are in the eastern counties. Something about the dry air, I think." No one responded to this. She said, "I didn't mean to interrupt. I just needed some air." She looked at both of them in turn, pleasantly, without edge. "I'll leave you to it." She walked back around the corner and stood against the warehouse wall and breathed. She pressed both palms flat against the wooden boards behind her and breathed slowly in and slowly out, and she thought, 7 towns, 7 platforms. 7 times she had stood in front of strangers and let their judgments determine the shape of her life. She thought, not this time. She went back inside. Gideon was near the door talking to Pete Darvish, and he saw her come in and his expression asked a question that she answered with a slight shake of her head. "Nothing. Later. We'll talk later." He nodded and let it go. But what she didn't see, and would not know until the following morning, was that Margaret Aldridge had left the warehouse about 20 minutes before Mara went outside for air and had gone directly to the home of 2 members of the Red Hollow Community Council, where she stayed for nearly an hour. Mara learned this from Pete, who learned it from his woman in town, who had learned it from her neighbor, who had seen Margaret's buggy outside the council chairman's house. Pete told her on Monday morning while they were doing the weekly inventory count, his voice careful and factual, the voice of a man conveying information without editorializing, because he decided she'd want to know and could be trusted to handle it. She kept counting sacks of flour while he talked. "What does the council have to do with the ranch?" she asked. "Nothing officially," Pete said, "but there's a water rights review coming up in November, a section of the creek that runs through Iron Ridge's eastern boundary. There's been a dispute about it for about 3 years with the Aldridge family's holdings. She stopped counting. She looked at him. He said, Gerald Aldridge has been trying to get the council to reclassify that section of creek. If it gets reclassified, Iron Ridge loses access to the best water source on the eastern pasture. She said, and the council review. Chairman Wills has been neutral on it for 2 years, Pete said. He's the deciding vote. She set her pencil down on the ledger. And Margaret visited him the night of the harvest social. Pete looked at a point somewhere above her left shoulder. That's what I've been told. She picked the pencil back up. She wrote the flower count in the ledger. She moved to the next item on the list. She said, Does Gideon know about this? He knows about the water rights dispute, Pete said. He doesn't know about last night. He needs to know about last night. Yes, Pete said. He does. She finished the inventory count, all the way to the end because the inventory count needed to happen regardless. And she had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do in a crisis was let the ordinary work stop. And then she went to find Gideon. He was in the far pasture, which was a 20-minute walk she did without hurrying because hurrying would suggest panic, and she wasn't panicking, she was calculating. She had learned the difference between those two states and the importance of making sure everyone around you could see the difference. She found him mending a section of fence at the edge of the eastern pasture, the creek visible about 60 yards behind him, glinting in the morning light. She told him what Pete had told her. She watched his face go through several things. Anger was one of them. She watched him handle it, press it down, hold it still, bring it under the kind of control that was not suppression, but management, the kind that meant it was still there but wasn't in charge. He said, She wouldn't. Mara said, Pete's information is usually accurate. He set down the fence tool. He looked at the creek. He said, That creek feeds the eastern pasture through July and August. Without it, he stopped, shook his head. Without it, I lose grazing access for about 40% of the cattle during the driest part of the year. I know, she said. I worked it out on the way here. He looked at her. She said, I also worked out that a water rights reclassification needs documentation. It needs survey records, historical usage records, access agreements. She paused. Do you have those? Somewhere, he said. My original land papers. They should show the creek access. Where are they? He said, In the house, in the desk in the study. Then that's where I'm going next, she said. Those records need to be in order before the November review. He was looking at her with that look again, the one she kept not knowing what to do with. He said, Mara. She said, What? He said, You don't have to do this. She said, I know I don't. I mean, it's not your fight. It may never be your fight. The courtship isn't Gideon, she said, and something in her voice stopped him. The creek is real. The threat to it is real. That has nothing to do with what the courtship is or isn't. If I can help prevent you from losing something significant, I'm going to help prevent that. I looked at him directly. That's the kind of person I am. If you decide that's inconvenient, then this is useful information about whether this arrangement makes sense. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, It's not inconvenient. She said, Good. She looked at the creek. Do you know what classification Margaret's husband is arguing for? Seasonal tributary, Gideon said, which would make it public access and remove my preferential rights. Is there historical documentation of its use as Iron Ridge property water? There should be. My father built this ranch. He had it surveyed twice. The original survey should show the creek as a designated water source for this land. And where are the survey documents? With the land papers. Then let's go find the land papers, she said, before someone decides they matter and starts looking for reasons they don't. She started walking back toward the house. He fell into step beside her after a moment, matching her pace, the creek at their backs, the morning light moving across the grass ahead of them. She said, Tell me about the original survey. When was it done? He said, 1861. Then again in 67 after a boundary dispute with the property to the north. She said, Good. 2 surveys, that's better than 1. Harder to argue with 2 surveys. He said, You know something about land documentation. She said, I know something about documentation in general. She kept walking. The boarding house I managed. The owner was involved in 2 property disputes during my time there. I sat in on the legal meetings because someone had to keep the record straight. She paused. I learned enough. He said, enough for what? She said, enough to know that a clear paper record is the best defense against someone who's decided to reinterpret your rights. The law follows evidence. Evidence follows documentation. Documentation follows whoever kept the better records. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Clara used to say that my father was obsessive about paperwork, and she was grateful for it. She said, your father was right. They reached the house. She went directly to the study, which was the one room she hadn't yet reorganized, partly because she'd sensed it was the room most freighted with things she didn't have the full context for. It had the quality of a space that was still largely as it had been when someone who was no longer here had used it last. The books on the shelf arranged in an order that made sense to whoever had arranged them. A small framed photograph on the desk that she had not looked at closely and did not look at closely now. Gideon went to the desk and opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a wooden box. Not unlike the one the supply records had been kept in, though older, with a different kind of care attached to it. He set it on the desk and opened it. Inside were papers going back 20 years. Deeds, survey records, correspondence with the land office, 3 separate sets of handwritten notes in what she recognized, from the signature at the bottom, as the elder Vale's hand. She sat down at the desk and started going through them. He stood for a moment. Then he said, I'll get coffee, and left the room. She worked for 3 hours. She found both surveys. She found the original deed, which described the creek by name, Ridgeline Creek, and specified it as a water source attached to Iron Ridge in language that was plain and unambiguous, the work of a man who had either expected disputes or had simply been thorough enough that disputes would be difficult. She found 3 letters between Gideon's father and the land office from the late 1860s, confirming the water access during a period of regional drought when allocation disputes had been common. She organized everything by date. She made a summary page in her own handwriting noting the key documents and their relevance. She put it all back in the box in the new order and set the summary page on top. When Gideon came back with coffee, she had been aware of him returning at some point and setting a cup near her elbow, and she had drunk it without looking up. She was reviewing the summary page. She said, your father was meticulous. He said, he was. She said, the creek access is unambiguous. 2 surveys, the original deed, and 3 letters confirming allocation. If the council reviews this honestly, there's no legal basis for reclassification. He said, and if they don't review it honestly? She said, then we need to make sure these documents exist somewhere other than this desk. He looked at her. She said, a copy at the land office. A copy with whoever serves as the regional legal authority. She paused. And I'd like to look at what the Aldridge claim is actually based on. You can't counter an argument you haven't read. He said, how do you know there's a written claim? Because Gerald Aldridge has been making this argument for 3 years, she said. Men who make arguments for 3 years have paperwork. She picked up the coffee cup. We need to find out what it says. He was looking at her with that expression again. She looked back at him, and this time she didn't redirect her attention. She just held the look. And something in it felt like the acknowledgement of a thing that neither of them had put into words yet, but that both of them knew was there. She said, I'm going to need access to the land office records. He said, I'll take you tomorrow. She said, good. He said, Mara. She said, what? He said, I want you to know that I understand what you're doing here is above and beyond. She said, I told you at the beginning, I can't operate in a place where I'm not given full information about what I'm working with. The water rights are part of what I'm working with. He said, that's not what I meant. She looked at him. He said, I meant I see it, what you're doing, and I don't take it lightly. The room was quiet. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening, the light going amber through the study window, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch continued their ordinary work. And she thought about what it meant to be seen, not evaluated, not assessed, but actually seen, by another person, and how rare that was, and how strange it felt after years of the alternative. She said, I know you don't. She closed the document box. She said, I'm going to make supper. The inventory is done and the documents are organized and the ceiling still needs patching, but that can wait until tomorrow. He said, I'll help with supper. She said, you'll be more hindrance than help. He said, probably true, but he followed her to the kitchen anyway, and she let him, and he handed her things when she asked and stayed out of the way when she didn't, And outside the light went slowly down and the first stars appeared and the ranch settled into its evening sounds. And the document box sat in the study with its contents in order, waiting for whatever came next. She knew what was coming next. She had been dealing with people like Margaret Aldridge her entire life. People who believed their certainty entitled them to action and their social position protected them from consequence. She knew the shape of what was being built against her and against this place, and she was not afraid of it. She was tired of it. That was different. But tired was not the same as finished, and she had never once in 32 years confused the two. She stirred the pot on the stove and thought about survey documents and water rights, and the expression on a man's face when he looked at her like she was someone worth looking at, and she kept her hand steady, and she kept moving forward, because that was what she did. That was what she had always done. The land office in Red Hollow occupied the narrowest building on Main Street, wedged between the general store and a barber shop that also served, by informal arrangement, as the town's primary source of news and opinion. Calloway ran it with the cheerful efficiency of a man who genuinely believed that clear property documentation was one of the finer contributions a person could make to civilized life. And the office reflected this. Records filed in labeled boxes, maps on the wall with boundaries marked in precise ink, a logbook at the front desk that tracked every inquiry and transaction going back to the town's founding. Mara had come prepared. She had the document box from the study, reorganized and indexed. She had her summary page. She had a list of specific questions written out the night before in the quiet hour after Gideon went to sleep, when she sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and worked through the logic of what she needed to understand before the November council review became something she couldn't get ahead of. Calloway met them at the door with his usual energy and looked at the box under Mara's arm and said, "I heard you might be coming in about the Ridgeline Creek matter." Gideon said, "News travels." Calloway said, "In a town this size, news doesn't travel so much as it just exists everywhere at once." He held the door open. "Come in. I've been expecting this conversation for a while, actually. Sit down." The office had 2 chairs in front of the main desk. Mara took one, set the document box on her knees, and opened it. Gideon took the other and sat with his arms on his thighs, leaning forward slightly, the posture of someone who was managing a strong preference for action and had decided that listening was, for the moment, the correct form of it. Calloway settled behind his desk and laced his fingers together. "Gerald Aldridge filed a formal petition for reclassification 14 months ago," he said. "I can show you the petition. It's part of the public record." "Please," Mara said. He found it without looking. The filing system was, she noted with professional appreciation, genuinely excellent. He laid it on the desk in front of her, and she read it the way she read supply records, completely, without skimming, looking for the structure of the argument rather than just its surface. The petition was 4 pages. Gerald Aldridge was claiming that Ridgeline Creek, in its eastern section specifically, the section that bordered Iron Ridge, had functioned historically as a shared water source between multiple landholders in the area, and that Gideon's father's designation of exclusive access had been a unilateral claim unsupported by regional usage patterns at the time. She read it twice. She said, "He's arguing that the original survey was self-serving rather than accurate." "That's the substance of it," Calloway said. "On what basis?" Calloway hesitated. There are 3 letters in his supporting documentation, from other landowners in the area circa 1864 to 1868, referencing the creek as shared resource. Mara looked at Gideon. He was looking at the petition with an expression she recognized from the kitchen ceiling conversation, the particular set of a person who has known something was there and is now confronted with its specific shape. She said, "Can I see the letters?" Calloway found them. She read all 3. They were genuine-looking documents, aged paper, period handwriting, the kind of casual references that appeared in correspondence between neighbors managing adjacent land. 2 of them mentioned the creek by name. One of them used the phrase "our shared water source" in a context that was either a description of actual shared use or the kind of casual language that neighbors used about features of a shared landscape without intending legal precision. She said, "Who are these landowners? Do their descendants still hold the land?" Calloway said, "The marsh property to the north changed hands twice. The current owner is unrelated to the original. The southern property, that's the Brewer family. Same family, 3 generations." She said, "Ed Brewer?" His grandfather originally, Calloway said. Ed is the current holder. She filed this away. Then she said, and the Aldridge claim, does it extend to current usage or only historical? The petition argues that if historical usage was shared, then the current exclusive designation is invalid, and the creek should be reclassified to allow public access. Calloway paused, which would effectively remove Iron Ridge's preferential rights during the dry months. When Iron Ridge needs them most, Mara said. Yes. Gideon said, what does the council need to rule in Gerald's favor? A majority vote that the historical evidence supports reclassification, Calloway said. 3 council members. Chairman Wills has been the swing vote. The other 2 have been split along predictable lines. Hartley owns land adjacent to Aldridge property and has a history of voting with Gerald's interests. Morrison has been sympathetic to Iron Ridge. Mara said, and Wills? Wills, Calloway said carefully, had dinner with the Aldridges last month. She looked at the petition in her hands. She looked at the 3 letters. She thought about what she had in the document box. The 2 surveys, the original deed, the 3 letters from the land office confirming allocation during the 1860s drought. She thought about Ed Brewer, who had spoken to her at the Harvest Social with genuine rather than prying curiosity, who had 3 generations of family memory in this valley. She said, these 3 letters in Gerald's documentation, were they submitted as originals or copies? Calloway paused. Copies. Where are the originals? According to the filing, Gerald holds them. Has anyone verified the originals against the copies? A longer pause. The petition was accepted as filed, Calloway said. Standard procedure for initial submissions is... Standard procedure, she said, not unkindly, is not the same as due diligence. She looked at him. I'm not suggesting anything about Gerald Aldridge specifically. I'm suggesting that if the council is going to make a decision about water rights based partly on 3 letters, those letters should be verified against their originals by someone independent. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that's a reasonable request to make of the council before the review. Yes, she said. It is. She closed the petition. She set it on the desk. She looked at Gideon. I want to talk to Ed Brewer. Gideon said, about what? She said, about what his grandfather actually meant when he wrote our shared water source in a letter to a neighbor in 1866. The drive to the Brewer property took 35 minutes on a road that ran along the southern edge of Iron Ridge's land, close enough to the creek that she could see it at intervals through the brush. The Ridgeline Creek, maybe 12 feet wide at its narrowest in this section, running clear over a rocky bed. She looked at it every time it appeared and thought about what 40% of Gideon's cattle needed from it between June and August, and what losing it would actually mean in practical terms. Not symbolic terms. Practical ones. She was a practical person. Ed Brewer was in his barn when they arrived, doing something to a piece of equipment with a wrench and the expression of a man who had been doing it for a while without the result he wanted. He looked up when the wagon pulled in and recognized Gideon and set the wrench down and came to meet them. I was 60-something, built close to the ground, with a face that had been formed by decades of outdoor work into something that was not handsome but was thoroughly trustworthy. He had spoken to Mara at the Harvest Social about the inventory system with the interest of someone who managed his own land carefully and recognized good management in others. He shook Gideon's hand and looked at Mara and said, Miss Holloway, this is about the creek. Not a question. Gideon said, how did you know? Brewer said, because if I were in your position, that's the only reason I'd be coming to see me. He looked at Mara. You figured out about my grandfather's letters. She said, I read them. He said, come inside, my wife will want to feed you, and it's going to take a few minutes to explain something. His wife, whose name was Ruth, and who had the manner of someone who had been married to a careful, practical man for long enough that she'd developed similar qualities without losing her own distinct character, produced coffee and something that appeared to be the remainder of a meat pie from earlier in the week, and they sat at the kitchen table and Ed Brewer put his hands flat on the table and said, my grandfather and the elder Vale were neighbors for 30 years. They had disagreements about the usual things, fencing, cattle drift, water during drought years. The letters Gerald Aldridge has were written during a dispute, not a period of harmony. Mara said, what kind of dispute? There was a bad drought in 65 and 66, Brewer said. The creek dropped to about half its normal flow. My grandfather felt that the Elder Vale's upstream use was affecting the downstream availability. He paused. When he wrote our shared water source, he was making an argument for his claim to access during the drought, not describing an established legal arrangement. He was saying, "This belongs to both of us. You don't get to take it all." It was a negotiating position. Gideon said, "How do you know this?" "Because my grandfather kept his own records," Brewer said, "and I've read them." He wrote about the dispute in his journals. The letters to Vale were one piece of a longer argument. They resolved it eventually. The Elder Vale agreed to limit upstream use during drought conditions, and they signed a private agreement about it. He paused. An agreement that was never part of Gerald Aldridge's petition, I'd guess. Mara said, "Is that private agreement documented?" Brewer looked at her steadily. "It is." She said, "Would you be willing to present it to the council review?" He said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask me that for 14 months. She said, "Why didn't you come forward before?" He said, "Because nobody asked, and because I don't involve myself in other people's business unless I'm invited." He looked at Gideon. "You should have come to me sooner." Gideon said, "I know that." Brewer said, "All right." He picked up his coffee cup. "What else do you need?" She told him. She explained the plan she'd been building in her head since the previous evening, the one that was not complicated because the best plans rarely were. A complete documentation package presented to the council before the review, organized and indexed, with the private agreement from 1866 as its centerpiece. A formal request for verification of Gerald Aldridge's letters against their originals. A written account from Brewer himself, contextualizing his grandfather's correspondence. Brewer listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You've done this before." She said, "Not this specifically." He said, "The thinking behind it, the how to put evidence in order so it speaks for itself." She said, "Yes, I've done that before." He said, "Where'd you learn it?" She said, "Property disputes at a boarding house I managed. The owner had a habit of acquiring things that other people later decided belonged to them." Brewer almost smiled. "And you helped him defend it." "I helped him document it," she said. "There's a difference. The documentation did the defending." Brewer nodded slowly. He said, "My grandfather's journals and the private agreement are in the house. I can have copies made by the end of the week." She said, "I'd appreciate that." On the drive back to Iron Ridge, Gideon was quiet for the first mile in the way that she had come to recognize as processing rather than withdrawal, working something through, arriving somewhere. He said, "He was right. I should have gone to him months ago." She said, "You didn't know what you had until someone organized the records well enough to see what was missing." He said, "That's generous." She said, "It's accurate." She looked at the road. "You're good at managing the large operations of this ranch. The land, the cattle, the hands, the seasonal work. You're not good at the documentation and administration behind it. That's not a character flaw. It's a skill gap, and skill gaps are what other people are for." He said, "Is that what you're for?" She said, "Partly." He said, "What's the other part?" She said, "I haven't finished deciding yet." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Fair enough." But she could feel him looking at the side of her face, and she kept her eyes on the road, and neither of them said anything else until Iron Ridge came into view. The following days had a quality of controlled urgency that she recognized from the boarding house years, the particular feeling of a situation that required sustained attention and would not be patient about receiving it. She worked on the documentation package in the mornings, in the study that she had gradually, without making any declaration about it, begun to use as a working space. The photograph on the desk she had moved to the shelf, not removed, moved with care, because it was not her place to remove it. But she could not work effectively with someone else's history watching her from 18 inches away. Gideon noticed the photograph's new position and said nothing. She took that as permission. Brewer's copies arrived on Friday, delivered by his eldest son, a young man of about 20 who had his father's build and his mother's directness, and who handed over the documents with the focused manner of someone who understood they were important. The private agreement from 1866 was exactly what Brewer had described, a handwritten document signed by both men, witnessed by a third party whose name Mara cross-referenced against the 1867 survey and found listed as a neighboring landholder, establishing clear parameters for upstream use during drought conditions while affirming the Elder Vale's primary rights to the creek. She read it 3 times. Then she read Gerald Aldridge's supporting letters again, and she looked at the date of the private agreement, and she saw something she hadn't noticed before. One of Gerald's 3 letters, the one using the phrase shared water source, was dated 6 months after the private agreement was signed, which meant that when Brewer's grandfather wrote that letter, the matter of the creek had already been settled. He was not making a claim. He was writing to a neighbor about their land in the casual way of men who had reached an understanding, using language that reflected a settled situation rather than a disputed one. It was not evidence of shared usage rights. It was evidence of a resolved dispute. She wrote this out clearly on a fresh sheet of paper. She added it to the documentation package. She sat back in the study chair and looked at the ceiling, not the cracked section in the kitchen, which she and Pete had patched the previous week, but the study ceiling, which was fine, which was solid, which held. She thought, this is winnable, not just defensible, actually winnable. She thought about Margaret Aldridge visiting Chairman Wills the night of the Harvest Social, and she thought about what that visit had been for, not to present evidence, she understood now, but to present impression. To establish in the chairman's mind, before the formal review, a picture of the situation that would make the evidence seem less important than the social context surrounding it. That was how you won things when you didn't have the documents. But when you had the documents could do the talking. She assembled the final package on Sunday evening. 3 copies. One for the council, one for Calloway's office, one for Iron Ridge's records. Each one organized identically. The original deed first, then the 2 surveys, then the land office letters from the drought period, then the private agreement, then Brewer's written statement contextualizing his grandfather's correspondence, then her own summary page laying out the chronology and its implications. She put a piece of cord around each copy, tied it the same way she tied the cord on her suitcase, the only way she knew. Gideon came into the study while she was finishing the 3rd copy. He looked at the 3 packages on the desk. He said, "You've been at this since morning." She said, "There were details to get right." He said, "Mara." He said it quietly, the way he sometimes said her name when he was not continuing a sentence so much as placing the name itself down somewhere, like setting something on a table to look at it. She looked up. He said, "I need to tell you something, and I want to say it correctly, so I'm going to take a minute to find the words." She waited. She was good at waiting. He said, "When I walked across that platform in Red Hollow 6 weeks ago, I had a practical reason. I needed someone who could see problems clearly and address them without waiting to be told. I'd been watching the selection for about an hour, and you were the only person on that platform who wasn't performing. You were just standing there, being exactly what you were. And I thought, that's a person who doesn't waste energy on appearances. That's a person I can work with." She said, "That's a practical reason." He said, "Yes. And then you spent 6 weeks being exactly that person. The inventory, the ceiling, the kitchen door, the document box. Ed Brewer." He paused. "And something else happened that I didn't plan for, and I'm not entirely sure how to talk about." She said, "You can say it plainly. I don't require careful language." He said, "I stopped thinking about this as a business arrangement sometime around the 2nd week. Maybe earlier. I'm not certain of the exact point, but somewhere in there I stopped evaluating whether you were useful and started just being glad you were here. And those are 2 entirely different things." The study was very quiet. She said, "I know." He said, "You know." She said, "I've been aware of it, the shift." She looked at her hands on the desk. "I've been careful not to assume it meant what it might mean, because I have a history of reading situations incorrectly, and I can't afford to do that here." He said, "You're not reading it incorrectly." She said, "I know that too, now." He said, "I'd like to ask you to stay." She said, "You haven't asked yet." He almost smiled. "I'm asking now. Not as an extension of the courtship, not as a business arrangement. I want you to stay at Iron Ridge because this place is better with you in it, and because I don't want to—" He stopped, found the words, continued. "I don't want to go back to what it was before." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "There are things I need you to understand before I answer." He said, "All right." She said, "I'm not Clara." She said it the way she'd said it in the kitchen on the first day, but differently, not as a boundary setting, more as a simple truth that needed to be on the table between them. "I'm not going to become her shape in this house. The things I've done here, the inventory, the study, the records, those are mine. The way I do them is mine. If you want me to stay, you're taking in the actual person, not a version of her that fits a space that was shaped by someone else. He said, I know that. She said, do you? Because 4 years is a long time to miss someone, and sometimes when we're missing people, we stop noticing we're asking the new thing to be the old thing. He was quiet for a moment. It was the honest kind of quiet, the kind where someone is actually considering rather than waiting to speak. He said, you're right that I've done that. I won't claim I haven't. He looked at her directly. But I've also watched you for 6 weeks, and what I want is what I actually see, not what I remember. She believed him. Not because she needed to believe him, not because it was easier, but because she had been watching him for 6 weeks in return, and she had not caught him in a single evasion. She said, and the water rights review. If the council rules against us in November, he said, if they rule against us with this documentation on the table, we take it to the regional court and we fight it there, with Brewer's statement and the private agreement and the complete record you've assembled. He paused. We. Not me. We. She heard that. She said, I'll stay. He said, all right. She said, I'll need the study as a working space. He said, it's yours. She said, the kitchen situation needs to be addressed before winter. The distance between the kitchen and the main house. I want to look at options for a covered passage. It doesn't have to be elaborate. He said, whatever you think it needs. She said, I think it needs a covered passage. He said, then we'll build one. She said, and I'd like to talk about the children in this valley. He paused. Children. She said, the schoolhouse on Main Street has been dark for at least 2 years. I've been asking around and there are somewhere between 20 and 30 children in this valley and the surrounding properties without consistent access to schooling. The nearest teacher left and wasn't replaced. She looked at him. I taught myself. At the boarding house, I ran reading and arithmetic sessions for the servants' children in the evenings. I know how to do it. He said, you want to open the school? She said, I want to look into what it would take to open the school. That's different. First you assess, then you act. He said, of course. She said, I'm telling you in advance so you're not surprised when I start making inquiries. He said, I appreciate the warning. And this time he did smile. Not the almost smile, the real one, which was not a large or demonstrative smile, but was entirely genuine, which was more than enough. She looked at the 3 document packages on the desk. She said, these need to be at the council office by Monday morning. He said, I'll take them first thing. She said, we'll take them. He said, we'll take them. She stood up from the desk. Her back ached from the day's work, which she acknowledged privately and did not mention, because it was information she would use to determine how long she could work at a desk without a break and not something that required external commentary. She said, I'm going to start supper. He said, I'll help. She said, you'll be more hindrance than help. He said, I know, I'm still coming. She said, fine, and walked out of the study, and he followed her, and somewhere outside Pete Darvish was saying something to one of the younger hands in his dry, unhurried voice, and the horses in the near barn were settling into their evening, and Iron Ridge made its ordinary sounds all around her, and she moved through them without feeling like a visitor. She had not felt like a visitor for some time now. She wasn't sure exactly when that had changed, somewhere between the kitchen door and the document box, somewhere between Brewer's kitchen table and this study that was now hers. The shift had not announced itself. It had just happened, the way most real things did, in the ordinary process of working and thinking and being present in a place until the place started to feel like yours. She got to the kitchen and started the fire and measured out the things she needed with the efficient economy of someone who has done the same task enough times that the motions are comfortable without being automatic. And Gideon handed her the flour without being asked because he had been watching her work long enough to know when flour was next. And she took it without comment because of course she did. The petition packages sat in the study, tied with cord, organized and ready. The ceiling in the kitchen was patched and solid. The inventory ledger was on its 3rd week of consistent entries, Pete's handwriting in the Monday column, reliable as a fence post. The crack that had been pulling away from the lath in the kitchen ceiling was sealed with plaster and would hold through the winter. The document box was organized and indexed, small things. But Mara Holloway had always understood that small things, attended to properly, were how you built something that lasted. She stirred the pot and listened to the ranch settle around her, and she thought about Monday morning and the council office and the clear, plain language of a private agreement signed in 1866 that was about to do exactly what it had been written to do, speak the truth of a thing clearly enough that no one could argue with it. She was ready for Monday. She had been ready for a long time. The council meeting was scheduled for the second Tuesday of November, which gave Mara 3 weeks from the Monday they delivered the documentation packages to Calloway's office. She used all 3 weeks. The first thing she did after they left the land office that Monday morning was ask Gideon to take her to see Chairman Wills. Not to lobby him. She was clear about that distinction, both to Gideon and to herself. She had no interest in the kind of backroom persuasion that Margaret Aldridge practiced, the dinner visits and quiet conversations designed to shape a man's thinking before the evidence was formally presented. What she wanted was simpler and, she thought, more effective. She wanted Wills to have seen her face before he saw her name on a document. Wills was a former surveyor, which she had learned from Calloway, and he ran a small map-making operation out of a building behind his house. He was perhaps 65, precise in the way that people who spent their working lives measuring things tended to be, with a surveyor's habit of looking at the world in terms of its actual dimensions, rather than its apparent ones. He received them without much ceremony. He had, she suspected, been expecting them. She did not make a speech. She said, "Mr. Wills, I understand you're the deciding vote on the Ridgeline Creek Review. I'm not here to tell you how to vote. I'm here to make sure you know that the documentation package submitted to Calloway's office this morning is complete and organized, and that if you have questions about any of it before the meeting, I'm available to answer them." Wills looked at her for a moment. He said, "You put the package together?" "Yes." Calloway said it was thorough. "It's complete," she said. "Thorough is a judgment, complete is a fact." Something shifted in his expression, the slight recalibration of a man who has revised an estimate. He said, "I'll read it carefully." She said, "That's all I'm asking." On the way back to the wagon, Gideon said, "That's all you're asking?" She said, "The documentation either speaks for itself or it doesn't. If I have to explain it to him in advance, it's not doing its job." He said, "Most people would have tried harder to persuade him." She said, "Most people don't have Ed Brewer's grandfather's private agreement in their documentation package." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair point." The second week she spent on the schoolhouse question, which was not directly related to the water rights, but which had its own urgency that she felt in a way she couldn't entirely explain in practical terms. She had been watching the children of Red Hollow for weeks, the ones who came into the general store with their parents, the ones she'd seen playing near the warehouse after the harvest social, the ones Pete Darvish had mentioned belonged to 3 of his hands, children who had been doing informal lessons at the kitchen tables of their parents' homes because there was nothing else available. She went to see the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon while Gideon was in the far pasture with Pete running a cattle count. She went alone, which she preferred for initial assessments. Other people's reactions to a situation had a way of interfering with her ability to read the situation itself. The schoolhouse was unlocked, which in a town like Red Hollow meant either that there was nothing worth stealing or that people trusted each other enough not to bother with locks. And she thought it was probably both. Inside it was dusty and cold and had the particular smell of an unused space. Not decay exactly, more like suspension, like something holding its breath. 2 rows of benches, a blackboard at the front, chalk still in the tray, as though whoever had last taught here had expected to return. A small stove in the corner. 3 windows on the east side, one with a crack in the glass that had let in enough weather to warp the floor beneath it slightly. She walked the length of it. She looked at the blackboard. She picked up a piece of chalk and held it for a moment and set it back down. She thought about what she'd said to Gideon about the children in the valley. 20 to 30 children without consistent schooling, which meant 20 to 30 children growing up without the basic tools that made everything else possible. The reading, the arithmetic, the ability to write a letter or understand a contract or keep a ledger. The tools that she had used her entire life to navigate a world that would have crushed her without them. She had been taught by a determined mother in a farmhouse kitchen and a series of people who had lent her books and expected them back with the pages read. She had never attended a formal school. She had assembled her education the way she assembled most things, from available materials through sustained effort, without waiting for ideal conditions. These children could have better than that. They could have an actual room with a blackboard and a stove, and someone who showed up every morning and expected them to show up in return. She went back to the general store and found the owner, a man named Taggart, who had been running it for 20 years and knew where most of the relevant information in Red Hollow was stored, and she asked him who owned the schoolhouse building. He said, "Town Council." She said, "Who was the last teacher?" He said, "Woman named Prescott. Left about 2 years ago. Husband got work in Denver." She said, "Has the council advertised for a replacement?" He said, "They've talked about it." She said, "Talking and doing are different things." He said, "Yes, they are." She said, "Thank you," and went back to the wagon and drove home. And that evening after supper, she wrote a letter to the council requesting a meeting about the schoolhouse separate from the water rights review, because she had learned that combining agendas was a way of letting one swallow the other, and she did not intend to let either thing be swallowed. Gideon read the letter when she was done and said, "You're going to run the school yourself." She said, "I'm going to propose a structure for reopening it. Whether I run it myself or help establish it for someone more formally qualified is a separate question." He said, "You're going to run it yourself." She said, "Parts of it, possibly." He said, "The children of my hands are among the ones who need it." She said, "I know, that's partly why." He said, "All right." She said, "You're not going to push back on the time it would require." He said, "Why would I push back on something that's obviously the right thing to do?" She looked at him. She said, "Most people would have practical objections." He said, "I have practical objections. The timing is complicated. You're already managing the household and the documentation work and the ranch administration. But," he paused, "you've been running at about 60% of your actual capacity since you got here. I've been watching. If you take on the school, you'll run at 90 and the ranch will probably be better organized, not worse." She stared at him for a moment. She said, "That's an accurate assessment." He said, "I have my moments." The third week before the council meeting arrived with a cold front that came down from the north and reminded everyone in the valley that winter was not theoretical. The creek dropped slightly, normal for the season, and Mara noted this in the inventory ledger under a new section she'd added for water access observations, because she had decided that if the creek was going to be a documented resource, it should be documented consistently across seasons, not just when it was under dispute. Pete found her noting the water level on a Thursday morning and stood beside her at the creek bank and said, "You think this is going to be regular now, checking it?" She said, "Every week, water level, clarity, any changes to the bank or flow." She wrote the numbers down. "If we ever have to defend this access again, I want 3 years of observation records on the table, not 3 weeks." Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he said, She said, "What?" He said, "Nothing. Just thinking my grandfather would have liked you." She said, "What was your grandfather like?" He said, "Stubborn, never wasted words, kept records of everything." She said, "That's a recommendation." He almost smiled, meant it as one. The council meeting convened on a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock in the building behind Callaway's land office that served as Red Hollow's civic space. A single large room with a long table for the council members and rows of chairs for observers. Because in a town this size, civic proceedings were by their nature public, and everyone who wanted to attend was entitled to do so. Mara had not expected the attendance. The room was nearly full when she and Gideon arrived, which was 20 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. She recognized most of the faces: Taggart from the general store, Mrs. Hatch, Lena Marsh, Callaway, who was present in his official capacity, several of the ranchers from the surrounding area, including Ed Brewer in the front row of observers with his wife Ruth beside him. Pete Darvish was near the back wall, hat in his hands, which meant he was there as a personal gesture rather than a professional one. 3 of Gideon's other hands were with him. She also saw, in the second row on the opposite side of the room, Margaret and Gerald Aldridge. Margaret was dressed carefully. Her expression was the composed, slightly elevated expression of a woman who has decided the situation is essentially already resolved in her favor and is primarily present to observe the confirmation of that fact. Gerald had his hands folded on his knees and was looking at the table where the council members were beginning to take their seats. Mara sat down next to Gideon and looked at the council table. Chairman Wills was in the center. To his left was Hartley, who had not looked at Mara when she came in, which was its own kind of information. To Wills's right was Morrison, who had. Morrison gave her a brief, neutral nod, and she returned it. Callaway called the room to order. The formal presentation of Gerald Aldridge's petition came first. Gerald himself read a summary of it, competently, without drama, the voice of a man who had been preparing this statement for months and had refined it to its clearest form. He emphasized the three letters. He emphasized the historical usage patterns he claimed they demonstrated. His voice was measured, and his argument was coherent, and if Mara had not spent 3 weeks inside the documentation, she might have found it persuasive. When he finished, Hartley said, "Thank you, Mr. Aldridge," with the warmth of someone who had already decided. Wills said, "Thank you." Now, the Council has also received documentation from Iron Ridge in response to this petition, and we've had a week to review it. Mr. Vale, Miss Holloway, I understand Miss Holloway assembled the response package? Gideon said, "She did." Wills said, "Miss Holloway, would you present it?" She stood. She had thought about how to do this. She had considered and rejected several approaches: the legalistic summary, the emotional appeal, the point-by-point refutation. What she settled on was the simplest possible version, because simple things were harder to argue with than complicated ones. She said, "The documentation we've submitted establishes 3 things. First, Iron Ridge's access to Ridgeline Creek was established in the original land deed and confirmed by 2 independent surveys. Second, there was a dispute in the 1860s between the Elder Vale and the Brewer family regarding creek use during drought conditions, and that dispute was resolved through a private agreement signed by both parties and witnessed by a third. Third, the letters Mr. Aldridge has submitted as evidence of historical shared usage were written after that agreement was signed in the context of a settled arrangement, not a disputed one." She paused. Mr. Aldridge's petition asks the Council to reclassify the creek based on an interpretation of those letters. We're asking the Council to read the letters in their full historical context, including the private agreement that predates them and the surveyor's notes that confirm their meaning. She looked at Wills directly. "The documentation speaks for itself. I'll answer questions if there are any." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Hartley said, "This private agreement, it was never submitted to the land office?" Ed Brewer spoke from the front row. "No, it was a private arrangement between neighbors. That was common practice at the time." Hartley said, "And how do we know it's authentic?" Brewer said, "Because my grandfather's signature is on it, and I know my grandfather's signature, and it matches every other document in his records from that period." He paused. "I've also submitted a written statement, which is part of the documentation package, contextualizing the agreement and confirming its authenticity from the family records perspective." Hartley said, "That's a family member speaking to family records." Wills said, "Ed, do you have an interest in the outcome of this review?" Brewer said, "No, the Brewer land doesn't border the disputed section. I have no water rights stake in the decision either way." Morrison said, "He has no financial interest in either outcome." And Hartley looked at him briefly and said nothing. Gerald Aldridge said, "If I may." Wills said, "Mr. Aldridge." Gerald said, "The private agreement, assuming its authenticity, addressed a specific drought situation. It doesn't speak to the broader question of historical shared usage." Mara said, "May I respond to that?" Wills looked at her. "Go ahead." She said, "The petition argues that historical shared usage establishes a basis for reclassification. The private agreement documents that a specific dispute about shared usage was resolved with explicit terms. If the creek had been a historically shared resource by established practice, there would have been no need for a private agreement settling the terms of use. The existence of the agreement is itself evidence that exclusive access was the default condition, not shared usage." Silence. Gerald opened his mouth, closed it. Hartley said, "That's a creative interpretation." Morrison said, "It's a logical one." Wills said, "The Council will take a recess to confer." The 3 Council members stood and went into the small room behind the main chamber and closed the door. The room they left behind exhaled collectively. A general release of held breath, a shifting of chairs, a low murmur of conversation that ran along the rows of observers like water finding its level. Gideon leaned toward her and said quietly, "That last point." She said, "What about it?" He said, "When did you think of that?" She said, "About 4 days ago. I wasn't sure I'd use it until just now." He said, "Why weren't you sure?" She said, "Because it's a logical argument, not an evidentiary one. It works if Wills is thinking clearly and not if he's already made up his mind." She glanced toward the Aldridges. Margaret was speaking very quietly to Gerald. her expression still composed, but with something behind it that was working harder than before. "We're about to find out which one it is." Across the room, she was aware of Mrs. Hatch watching her from the third row. When Mara met her eyes, the older woman gave her a single, small nod. Not encouragement exactly, more like recognition. The nod of one practical woman to another. The council returned after 11 minutes. Will sat down. He put both hands flat on the table the way Brewer had put his hands flat on his kitchen table, and she noted the similarity and wondered if it was a regional habit or simply what careful people did when they were about to say something that required steadiness. He said, "The council has reviewed the documentation submitted by both parties and has conferred on the relevant questions. Our finding is as follows." He looked at the room. "The petition for reclassification of the eastern section of Ridgeline Creek, as submitted by Gerald Aldridge, is denied. The historical documentation submitted by Iron Ridge establishes clear and consistent access rights that predate and supersede the claimed shared usage. The private agreement of 1866 is accepted as a material document confirming that any dispute regarding creek use was resolved between the relevant parties, and the letters submitted in support of the petition are understood within that historical context rather than outside it." He paused. "Iron Ridge's water access rights to the eastern section of Ridgeline Creek are confirmed as established. This matter is closed." The room did several things at once. Morrison looked at Hartley. Hartley looked at the table. Ed Brewer put his hand briefly on his wife's hand, and Ruth Brewer closed her fingers around his. Pete Darvish, in the back of the room, did something with his hat that was not quite hitting it against his thigh, but was in that direction. Taggart said something quietly to the man beside him. Margaret Aldridge stood up. The room noticed this. The room went still in the way rooms go still when someone who carries a certain kind of social weight does something unexpected. Margaret said, "Mr. Chairman," Will said, "The matter is closed, Mrs. Aldridge." She said, "I simply want to note," Will said, "Mrs. Aldridge." He said it the way Gideon had said her name at the Harvest Social, gently, with finality, like a door closing. "The matter is closed." Margaret sat down. The room took a breath. Gerald Aldridge did not look at Mara. He gathered the papers in front of him and stacked them with precise movements and tucked them into the leather folder he'd brought, and stood and put on his hat, and Margaret rose beside him, and they walked out of the room with the controlled dignity of people who have decided that composure is the most they can offer the situation. At the door, Margaret paused. She turned and looked directly at Mara across the width of the room. It was not a hostile look. It was not concession either. It was the look of a woman reassessing. Not the situation, which was over, but the person who had been at the center of it. The look of someone who had formed a picture and was now looking at the actual thing and finding the dimensions different from what she'd calculated. Then she turned and went through the door, and Gerald followed, and they were gone. Gideon said, "You all right?" Mara said, "Yes." He said, "That was..." She said, "Don't." He said, "Don't what?" She said, "Don't make it into a speech. It went well. That's enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." Ed Brewer reached them before they got to the door. He shook Gideon's hand and then turned to Mara and said, "My grandfather would have been pleased to know his paperwork mattered." She said, "Your grandfather's paperwork was very good." He said, "He was a thorough man." She said, "The best ones usually are." Ruth Brewer touched her arm briefly. Not quite a hug, more the kind of physical acknowledgement that women sometimes offer each other when words feel insufficient. And then they were past the door and in the cold November air, and Mara breathed it in, the clean cold of a morning that had been resolved. She thought, this is what it feels like when the documents do their job. She thought, I built that. With my hands and my pencil and 3 weeks of work. She thought, I am not too much. I never was. The problem was always that the world was too small to hold what I actually had to offer. She did not say any of this. She walked to the wagon and got in, and Gideon got in beside her, and they drove back to Iron Ridge in the thin winter light with the creek running alongside the road for part of the way, clear and unhurried, doing what it had always done. The schoolhouse opened in the second week of January. It did not open as a formal school in the official sense that would require a council designation and a teacher with formal credentials and a budget that the town hadn't yet approved. What it opened as was something more informal, and she suspected more durable. A morning session 3 days a week, run by Mara, for any child whose family wanted to bring them. She went back to the schoolhouse in November, after the council meeting, and spent 2 afternoons assessing what it needed. The cracked window replaced. The stove cleaned and confirmed as functional. The benches repaired where 2 of them had developed the kind of wobble that made sustained sitting unreliable. She found 4 additional pieces of chalk in a drawer. She found a box of worn arithmetic primers under the teaching table, a reader in better condition, and a set of handwriting practice sheets that were yellowed but still legible. She put it all in order. She told Gideon what she was doing, and he said, "What do you need?" And she gave him a list, and it was done by the following week. She told Pete, who told his hands, and 2 of his hands came to her separately to ask whether their children could attend. And she said yes. Of course, that was the whole point. Lena Marsh heard about it through whatever mechanism the women of Red Hollow used to transmit information with impressive efficiency, and came to find Mara at the general store and said, "I've been waiting for someone to do this for 2 years. My niece's children have been doing lessons at the kitchen table." Mara said, "Tell them to come Tuesday morning." Lena said, "Can I help?" Mara looked at her. She said, "Can you read?" Lena said, "I can." She said, "Then yes." On the first Tuesday morning, 14 children arrived. She had expected perhaps 8. 14 walked through the schoolhouse door, ranging from 6 years old to 12, some accompanied by parents who stood awkwardly at the back of the room for a while before she gently indicated with a look that their children were fine and they could go. And they sat on the benches and looked at her with the particular attentive wariness of children who are in a new situation and have not yet decided whether it is safe. She picked up a piece of chalk. She said, "We're going to start with something you already know. Every person in this room already knows more than they think they do. We're going to figure out what that is, and then we're going to build on it." A small girl in the front row, 6, maybe 7, with the serious expression of a child who takes things seriously, said, "How do you know we know things?" Mara said, "Because you got here. You navigated your way to this room on a cold morning, which means you understood directions and made decisions and arrived at a specific time. That's 3 things already. We're just going to add more." The small girl considered this. She said, "Oh." Mara wrote the alphabet on the board. She had not expected to feel what she felt in that moment, standing at the front of a room with chalk in her hand and 14 children watching her, the cold stove warming slowly, the winter light coming through the repaired window. She had expected to feel competent, which she was, and purposeful, which she also was. She had not expected to feel, with a sudden and somewhat inconvenient clarity, that this was a thing she had been meant to do and had simply not found the right conditions for until now. She did not make a speech about this to herself. She just wrote the alphabet on the board and began. By the end of January, there were 21 children attending. By the end of February, there were 26, which was approximately every child in Red Hollow and the surrounding properties whose families could reasonably bring them on 3 mornings a week. Lena Marsh was helping with the younger children, and the wife of one of Gideon's hands, a woman named Clara, which Mara did not comment on because names were names and coincidences were not omens, had started coming in to help with reading on Fridays. The council approved a formal designation in March, which meant a small budget for supplies and the official status of the Red Hollow Community School, which was not much on paper, but which meant that the schoolhouse would be maintained and the sessions would be recognized as legitimate, which in a small town was not a small thing. Taggart donated a new set of arithmetic books. Mrs. Hatch organized a collection that produced enough for curtains and a proper rug to replace the threadbare one that had been there when Mara first walked in. Ed Brewer sent his granddaughter, who was 8 and already reading at a level that told Mara someone had been working with her carefully at home, and he came with her the first morning and stood at the back of the room and watched for a while, and then came to where Mara was standing and said simply, "Thank you." And she said, "Thank her grandfather's thorough records." And he almost laughed. Gideon came once, in February, on a Tuesday morning. He sat in the back row on a bench that was too small for him and watched her work for about 45 minutes, and then left without interrupting. And that evening he said, "You're very good at it." She said, "The children do most of the work." He said, "That's what good teaching is." She said, "I know that now." He said, "You always knew it." She thought about that. She said, "I knew it in theory." He said, "Theory and practice." She said, "Yes." They had married in December, on a quiet Saturday morning at the house, with Pete Darvish and Ed and Ruth Brewer and Lena Marsh as witnesses, and Mrs. Hatch, who had not been invited but had arrived the evening before with a pie and the clear intention of staying standing in the doorway of the main room. It was not a ceremony with many words. Neither of them were people with a taste for ceremony. And it was over in 20 minutes, and then they had pie and coffee, and Pete made a toast that was 3 sentences long and entirely adequate, and that was the sum of it. Margaret and Gerald Aldridge were not there. They had not been invited. In the weeks following the council meeting, Margaret had not approached Mara directly, but something had shifted in the way the town read the two of them in relation to each other. Some balance that had been uncertain was now settled, not through drama or confrontation, but through the simple accumulation of what had happened and what it demonstrated about who each of them was. In January, Margaret stopped by the schoolhouse on a Thursday morning when the session was running. She stood outside the window for a few minutes. Mara saw her from inside between explaining a subtraction problem and handing out the handwriting sheets, and then she went away. In February, she came inside. She stood at the back of the room for perhaps 20 minutes while Mara worked with a group of older children on a passage from the reader, listening to them puzzle through unfamiliar words, correcting them without shame, asking them to try again rather than telling them the answer, because telling people the answer was the fastest way to ensure they never learned to find it themselves. When the morning session ended and the children filed out into the cold, Margaret was still there. Mara waited. Margaret said, "Clara used to talk about wanting a school here." Mara said, "I didn't know that." Margaret said, "She thought the children in this valley deserved better access to education." She paused. She'd have been glad to see this. Mara looked at her. She said, "That's generous of you to say." Margaret said, "I'm not always generous. I'm sometimes right." She said this with the directness of a woman who has had weeks to sit with something uncomfortable and has decided to be honest about it rather than continue avoiding it. There was no warmth in it yet. Warmth would take longer, if it came at all. But there was something that was the precondition of warmth, which was honesty about the absence of it. Mara said, "I know." Margaret looked at the blackboard, where the day's work was still written. The alphabet for the youngest, a passage from the reader for the middle group, a column of arithmetic problems for the oldest. She said, "Gerald withdrew the petition formally last week. You probably know that." "Calloway told us," Mara said. "It was the right thing to do," Margaret said. "Given the documentation." She said it flatly, without hedging. That was something, at least. "Gerald, he overreached. He has a habit of that, and I don't always stop him when I should." Mara said nothing, because Margaret had not finished. Margaret said, "I had reasons for the positions I took. I thought they were the right reasons. I'm less certain of that now than I was." She looked at Mara directly. "That's not an apology. I'm not sure I owe one yet. But it's honest." Mara said, "Honest is enough for now." Margaret nodded, once the nod of a woman who has said what she came to say and found it received without either warmth or rejection, which was probably what she'd deserved. She put on her hat and walked to the door, and at the door she paused and said, "The arithmetic on the board, the column on the right. There's an error in the 4th problem." Mara looked at the board. She looked at the 4th problem. She said, "I know. I put it there on purpose. I want the older children to catch it." A pause. Then Margaret said, and went out. Mara turned back to the board. She looked at the error she had placed there deliberately, the small wrong thing waiting to be caught by a child who had learned to look carefully. She thought, even in this I am teaching them what I know, that errors exist, that they can be found, that finding them is not a failure, but the whole point. Spring came to Red Hollow the way spring always comes to dry country. Grudgingly, then all at once, the brown grass going green in a matter of days, the creek running higher with snowmelt, the light shifting from the flat gray of winter to something with actual warmth in it. Mara noticed the spring because she noticed everything about Iron Ridge now, with the attention of someone who understood that paying attention to a thing was one of the ways you took care of it. She noticed the creek level rising, which she recorded in the water observation ledger. She noticed 3 sections of fence on the northern boundary that had weakened over the winter, which she told Pete, who was already aware and had scheduled repairs for the following week. She noticed that two of Gideon's hands had been sharing a bunkhouse bunk with a broken leg for the better part of a month, and nobody had addressed it, and she had someone fix the leg within 48 hours of noticing, which she mentioned to Gideon, who said, "Thank you," and looked slightly ashamed. She said, "I'm not criticizing." He said, "I know, but I missed it." She said, "You can't see everything. That's why we're two people." He said, "Is that a philosophical statement or a ranch management statement?" She said, "Both." The inventory system was in its sixth month of consistent operation. Pete had taken to it with the convert's enthusiasm of someone who had spent years working around a problem and was relieved to have an actual solution. The Monday count was done without fail. The threshold numbers caught 3 potential shortages before they became shortages. The grain situation, the original catastrophe that had shaped everything, could not repeat under the current system, because the conditions that had created it had been replaced with conditions that made it impossible. Mara added a seasonal adjustment to the system in March, recalibrating the threshold numbers to account for the increased demand of spring calving and the summer grazing shift. It took her an afternoon. Pete reviewed it and made 2 suggestions, one of which she incorporated and one of which she explained was unnecessary, and he agreed with her explanation, and that was how they worked now. On a Thursday afternoon in April, she was in the study. Her study, she thought of it that way now, without guilt, because Claire's photograph was on the shelf and was part of the room's history rather than its present, and the room's present was hers. When she heard a wagon in the yard and then voices, and then Gideon appeared in the study doorway and said, "Someone's here for you." She said, "Who?" He said, "Dorothea." She stood up. Dorothea had not changed substantially since the coach ride into Red Hollow. Still slight, still tending toward nervous movement in her hands. Still with the quality of someone who was more resilient than she appeared and was slowly discovering this. She was with her husband, the ruddy-faced farmer she'd stepped off the platform with at the selection, whose name turned out to be Harris, and who had a handshake like a man who respected a handshake and a way of standing near his wife that was protective without being restrictive. They had come, Dorothea explained over coffee at the kitchen table. The kitchen that was now connected to the main house by the covered passage that had been built in February. An addition so obviously necessary that Pete had said upon its completion that he couldn't understand why it hadn't always been there, because she had heard about the school. "We have a daughter," Dorothea said. "She's 4, too young yet. But Harris's sister has 3 children between 6 and 10, and they're out on the Brower property, which is close enough for Tuesday and Thursday mornings." Mara said, "Tell them to come." Dorothea said, "There's more." Mara waited. Dorothea said, "I taught for 2 years before everything, in Ohio, formal training." She looked at Mara with the careful expression of someone making an offer they're not sure will be received. "I'm not suggesting I should take over," Mara said. "I need someone with formal training to apply for the county certification. It would give the school access to resources I can't unlock without a credentialed teacher on record." Dorothea blinked. "I hadn't thought about certification." Mara said, "I've thought about little else for 3 months. I don't have formal credentials. I can run the school, and I will, but the county office won't recognize it for funding without someone on record with a teaching certificate." She looked at Dorothea. "Do you still have yours?" Dorothea said, Yes, I brought my papers when we came west." Mara said, "Then you're exactly what I need." Dorothea looked at her for a moment. Something moved across her face. Something that might have been the relief of being seen clearly, of having something to offer and having it received not with politeness but with genuine use. She said, "The children on the Harris property could use Fridays." Mara said, "Then Fridays." Harris said from across the table, "You're going to want to know what I paid for my seed this spring. There's a new supplier coming through from the south, and I don't think most of the ranchers around here know about him yet." Mara looked at him. She said, "Tell me." He told her. She wrote it in the ledger. That was how things worked now at Iron Ridge. Information came in from every direction, and there was a system for receiving it, and the system was maintained, and the ranch did not lose horses to empty grain stores, and the water rights were documented and defended, and the children in the valley were learning to read, and the covered passage between the kitchen and the house meant that supper arrived warm even in the worst January weather. None of it was perfect. The fence on the north boundary had to be repaired twice that spring before it held. One of the Monday inventory counts in March revealed a discrepancy that took 2 days to track down, a misshelved delivery that had been recorded but not physically placed where the record said it was. The schoolhouse stove was temperamental in damp weather, and twice in February the morning sessions ran cold until Pete's nephew, who had some skill with metalwork, came and adjusted something about the flue. Mara noted all of these things in their appropriate places and addressed them in order of urgency and did not expect them to stop occurring, because things did not stop occurring. That was the nature of a living system. It required continuous attention, not because it was failing, but because it was alive. She had understood this about ranches before she arrived at Iron Ridge. She had been less certain she understood it about people, about herself specifically, about the continuous attention that a life required, about the fact that maintaining a person, like maintaining a ranch, was not a problem to be solved once and set aside, but an ongoing project that never fully resolved, and that this was not a deficiency but a condition of being something worth maintaining. She was 32 years old. She had spent 11 years being evaluated against a standard. She'd had no hand in defining, in rooms where the measure of her worth was whether someone else found her acceptable. She had carried that experience the way you carry something heavy over a long distance, not always conscious of it, but always aware of what it was costing. She was not carrying it the same way now. This was not because Iron Ridge had healed her, or Gideon had rescued her, or the council vote had vindicated her, or the children in the schoolhouse had given her purpose, though all of those things were true in partial and complicated ways. It was because she had done what she'd always done, looked at the situation clearly, assessed what was needed, and applied herself to the actual problem. And this time, the situation had been one in which her particular way of being in the world was an asset rather than an inconvenience. She had not changed. The conditions had changed, and that was the thing she had needed to learn. Not that she was enough, because she had always been enough, but that enough was not a fixed target that existed independently of where you were standing. It was relational. It was about fit, about finding the place where what you actually were could actually be used. She was standing in that place now. On a Saturday afternoon in late April, she went to the creek, not to take a water level observation, though she brought her notebook, because bringing the notebook was a habit, and habits were how things got done consistently rather than occasionally. She went because the afternoon was warm for the first time all year, with a quality of light that made the valley look like it had finally exhaled, and she wanted to see the creek the way you sometimes want to see something that you've been fighting for, not in the context of the fight, but just as itself. She sat on the bank and looked at the water. Ridgeline Creek ran clear and steady, the way it had always run, the way it would continue to run. Now that the documentation of its use was solid and organized and existed in 3 separate locations, in the event anyone ever questioned it again. The water moved over the rocky bottom with the indifferent efficiency of something that had been doing the same thing for longer than any of the humans arguing about it had been alive. She heard footsteps behind her and did not turn because she knew those footsteps. Gideon sat beside her on the bank. He did not say anything immediately, which was one of the things she had come to value about him. The capacity to be present in a place without filling the place with words. After a while, he said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "I'm thinking about fit." He said, "What about it?" She said, "About how long I spent looking for a place where what I was would be useful rather than inconvenient, and how the looking was exhausting, and how the thing I actually needed was here the whole time. Not the specific place, not this ranch, but the conditions. A place that needed what I actually had, that could use it." He said, "Do you think you would have found it eventually? Without all of this?" She thought about it honestly. She said, "I don't know, maybe. I'm practical enough that I think I would have kept trying until I did." She looked at the water. "But I think I might have worn down to something smaller first, something more careful. I was already starting to." He said, "You don't seem small to me." She said, "No, I know." He said, "You never did." She said, "I know that too." The creek moved over its stones. Somewhere behind them, in the direction of the house, she could hear one of the hands whistling something tuneless while he worked. The ordinary sound of ordinary work, the sound of Iron Ridge going about its day. She opened her notebook and wrote the water level observation. Because the notebook was there, and the habit was the habit, and some things you did regardless of the occasion, because the record was the record, and it mattered regardless of what else was happening around it. Gideon watched her write. He said, "Still keeping the weekly count." She said, "Every week. That's the point of a system." He said, "You think we'll ever need those records again?" She said, "I think you always need the records again eventually. That's why you keep them before you need them." He said, "Hmm." She closed the notebook. She looked at the creek one more time, at the water doing its simple, continuous, necessary work. And she thought about all the small things she had repaired and organized and built since she'd arrived at Iron Ridge: the inventory, the ceiling, the kitchen door, the documentation, the school, the covered passage, the weekly creek count. None of them dramatic, none of them sufficient on their own, all of them essential. She thought about a woman who had stood on 7 platforms and been evaluated and found insufficient, not because she was, but because the people evaluating her were looking for something decorative and she was something functional, and those are different requirements that produce different responses. And neither the requirement nor the response told you anything definitive about the actual value of the thing being evaluated. She thought about 32 years of being too large and too capable and too direct and too much. And she thought about the particular exhaustion of spending years trying to be less of those things in the hope that less would be more acceptable. And she thought about the moment she had stopped trying to be less, and what that had cost her, and what it had eventually produced. She thought, "I was never too much. I was always exactly the right amount. The rooms were just the wrong size." She had found the right-sized room. She intended to stay in it. She stood up from the creek bank and brushed the grass from her skirt and tucked the notebook under her arm, and Gideon stood beside her, and they walked back toward the house together in the late afternoon light, across land that was documented and defended and theirs, past the fence that held, toward the covered passage and the warm kitchen beyond it, into the life that had been built one small thing at a time, by 2 imperfect people who had looked at each other clearly and decided that what they saw was worth choosing. The creek ran behind them, doing what it had always done. The record in the notebook was accurate and complete. The work, as always, continued.